FBI detective, this video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 576. Luo An. I don't have much to invest. New York, Wall Street, the 10th floor of a building. Looking at the silent white man in front of him, Luo An sat and waited, and the other party's information emerged in his mind. Michael Bray, a value investor, fund manager, and the head of a company called Air Capital. Before 2008, although the other party was famous, not many people knew him. It was not until the subprime mortgage crisis and the financial crisis broke out that Michael Bray's reputation became well known by many people. Because he has a record, he was the first man who found that the subprime mortgage crisis would definitely break out by studying the instructions, interest rate, floating data, loan repayment status, etc. of subprime mortgage bonds, and then shorted the federal real estate industry. The means he used was to create and purchase a CDS financial product in many investment banks such as Goldman Sachs, Lehman Brothers, Deutsche Bank, and Bear Stearns. The specific content of CDS is complicated. To make a simple analogy, it is like someone buying an insurance policy for the car of Luo An next door. Although he is not the owner of the car, if the car is scrapped, he can take this insurance policy to the insurance company to collect the money. Someone is betting that Luo An's car will be scrapped, and the insurance company is betting that it will not be scrapped. This insurance policy is a legal gamble. This car is the federal real estate industry. Mr. Greenwood, there is one thing I don't quite understand. After a long pause, Michael Bray looked up at Luo An and asked, there are many CDS products on sale in the market outside. Why don't you go to them to buy? Instead, come to me to invest. Since creating the credit default swap product CDS with the content of the federal real estate industry and spending a large amount of money to buy it, Michael Bray's reputation has begun to resound through Wall Street. However, this reputation is not very good. Everyone praises him as a big fool behind his back. Because the federal real estate industry is thriving, no one thinks it will have problems. Luo An smiled and said, you need help. I need an experienced person to help me grasp the investment. Shorting the federal real estate industry is not as simple as buying a CDS financial product. After all, in addition to Class A CDS, there are many Class B and Class C CDS on the market, and the content is complicated and trivial. It is now April 2006, and there are still 16 months to August 2007. With such a long time, it is impossible for Luo An to spend all his energy on this matter. Mr. Greenwood is really honest. Hearing Luo An's words, Michael Bray laughed. Without hesitation, he nodded and agreed, and then said, there are some things I need to declare in advance. I will guarantee that all the funds you invest will be used to purchase CDS financial products that short the federal real estate industry. But this matter will take a long time. I'm afraid that I will not return your funds to you before April 2007. Since creating and purchasing this CDS product in 2005, Michael Bray has been under great pressure. He took a total of $1.3 billion from investors to short the federal real estate industry, but the federal real estate industry is thriving, and there is no sign of collapse at all. Michael Bray also needs to pay a large fee to investment banks such as Goldman Sachs every month according to the CDS regulations. In order to succeed, Michael Bray even forcibly tied up the money of those investors and refused to let them withdraw their investment, which caused those investors, including Michael Bray's boss, to curse at him. This is also the reason why Rohn said Michael Bray needed help before. Rohn did not refuse Michael Bray's request, but did not agree immediately. Instead, he asked, Mr. Bray, are you sure the time is April 2007? Michael Bray narrowed his eyes slightly. Mr. Greenwood, do you have doubts about this time? Indeed, there are some. Rohn nodded. He knew why Michael Bray set the time in April 2007, because the federal bank would raise interest rates for the first time around that time. Michael Bray's bet was that as the bank raised interest rates, federal citizens who borrowed money to buy houses would start to be unable to repay their loans and choose to run away, eventually leading to the collapse of the federal real estate industry. Michael Bray chuckled and said, "Mr. Greenwood, if you have any doubts about the time, I suggest you." Hearing the word, Luo An interrupted him. "I think the time is too short." Too short? Hearing this word, Michael Bray was stunned and then asked with a tense face, "Mr. Greenwood, is there any news?" Thinking of Luo An's FBI identity, Michael Bray's first thought was that he had heard some inside information. "No, I don't have any news." Luo An shook his head and then smiled. "Mr. Bray, you are concerned about data and market rules. But what I'm concerned about is people's hearts and means. The Wall Street business war in the novel, strategy, means, overall view, brilliant prediction, and virtual war of the world's top minds. But the real business war in reality is to unplug the network cable, delete the code, and shut down the server. The most high-end business wars often only require the simplest tricks, such as poisoning and robbery." Luo An knew that when the federal government raised interest rates for the first time and the federal government could not repay its debts and began to run away, the first thing that the investment banks on Wall Street thought about was definitely not how to solve the debt problem, but to transfer and sell these junk debts to people who did not know the truth. Those investment banks will continue to whitewash the situation, and the stocks of the federal real estate industry will not fall until a certain investment bank can no longer hold on and goes bankrupt. This period of time will take at least a few months. So Luo An said, "I think it would be better to push the time back a few months." For some considerations, Luo An did not specify the specific time, but only made suggestions. Hearing Luo An's words, Michael Bray was silent for a long time, suddenly stood up, and stretched out his hand to Luo An, shook his hand heavily, and said with a serious face, "Mr. Greenwood, I promise you that this time will succeed." Michael Bray is a very rational person. He firmly believes that the data will not be wrong and things will develop according to the results shown by the data. But Luo An's words just now reminded him that the data is indeed correct, but humans have subjective initiative, and some things will always become very strange due to human ideas. Luo An smiled and shook hands with Michael Bray, who then asked, "I wonder how much investment you have prepared, Mr. Greenwood?" Since Michael Bray founded Air Capital, he has continuously created amazing returns for investors. In 2001, Air Capital's return rate was 55.44%, and in 2003, Air Capital's return rate was 50%. Michael Bray asked for a lot of commissions, but he also respected his customers and always believed that sincerity was the most useful investment. After listening to Luo An's words just now, Michael Bray, who had awakened to many things, was very grateful to Luo An because he could avoid many detours. Michael Bray had already made plans in his heart. Even if Luo An's investment was only a few $100,000, he would strive for the maximum return for Luo An. "The investment I can take out is not much." Luo An smiled and took out a piece of paper with an account number from his pocket. Michael Bray's expression remained unchanged. He had long been prepared for the fact that Owen didn't have much money, so he sat down on the chair, started the computer, and started to prepare for work, and asked, "Can you tell me the specific amount?" Roan put the note on the desk and smiled. "Not much, just 450 million. Hearing the number Roan said, Michael Bray's keyboard action was stunned, and then turned his head with an incredible look on his face. "Sorry, Mr. Greenwood, I think I heard it wrong. You just said." "You heard it right. It's 450 million. Roan's mouth corners slightly raised. He actually had a total of 550 million US dollars. In order to be on the safe side, he finally chose to leave 100 million untouched. After getting a positive answer, Michael Bray's eyes widened, and his face was full of surprise. His throat rolled, but he didn't know what to say. Suppressing the shock in his heart, Michael Bray said in a deep voice, "Mr. Greenwood, with a principal of 450 million US dollars, I can help you buy up to 3 billion US dollars of CDS products for BBB level." Chapter 577 14 months. New situation. 3 billion US dollars. Hearing the number Michael Bray said, Roan narrowed his eyes slightly, pondered for a few seconds, and asked, "So, what is the price?" Seeing that Roan was not frightened by the number he said, or showed uncontrollable excitement, Michael Bray looked at Roan deeply and explained, if you decide to buy a CDS product worth $450 million, you need to pay 0.3% per month, which is $1.35 million US dollars. It is now April 2006. If the time is set in June 2007, the total premium will be around 17.5 million US dollars. Good. Roan nodded, handed the note to Michael Bray, and smiled. Then I'll wait for your good news. Definitely. Michael Bray nodded heavily and said seriously, we will succeed. Roan shook hands with Michael Bray. He believed that he would succeed, but the final number would not be 3 billion US dollars. Having lived in the Federation for so long, Roan deeply understood that the so-called spirit of contract was a joke, and shamelessness and cheating were the true nature. The number of $3 billion is too big, and those investment banks will not be willing to give up this money. If nothing unexpected happens, this CDS purchase agreement will eventually be bought back by an investment bank. Luo An inferred that the final transaction price should be between $1 billion and $1.5 billion. $450 million becomes $1 billion to $1.5 billion, a 2 to 3 times return. Wait for 14 months. Walking out of the building, looking at the Wall Street bronze bull that was about to rush not far away, Luo An whispered to himself with a smile on his face and turned to walk in another direction. A few hours later, Luo An drove back to Washington, D.C. Back at the villa, Caroline did plan to leave the Federation and return to Europe. Seeing this, Luo An did not say much, but simply helped her pack some luggage. The next morning, when it was time to go to work, Luo An first went to Verine's office, briefly described the handling process of the previous Las Vegas case, and handed over the case handling funds for this case to Verine's. Verine's simply praised Luo An, and then sent Luo An the case expenses spent on the previous case, that is, the Ponzi scheme case, in a folder. Luo An fell into deep thought when he looked at the $800,000 on the account. He remembered that the amount he reported before seemed to be $200,000. What's wrong? Seeing Luo An silent, Verine's raised her eyebrows and asked, any questions? Luo An closed the folder and smiled. No problem, thank you, sir. Good. Verine's nodded with satisfaction and looked down to see that Luo An reported that the case expenses for going to Las Vegas this time were $300,000. She was silent for a moment, picked up the pen, and crossed it twice without saying a word, and the number became $800,000 again. Luo An's mouth twitched when he saw Verine's action. Just as he was about to speak, Verines put the folder aside, then handed Luo An a red folder, and said seriously, Luo An, the vacation is over. There is a case that needs you to lead the number 13 investigation team to handle. Reaching out to take the folder, Luo An casually asked, what case is it again? A serial murder case. Verines crossed her hands, her face serious, and said in a concentrated voice, this case is more complicated. From the discovery of the first victim to the recent appearance of new victims, the time span in between has reached more than 10 years. A serial murder case spanning more than 10 years. In the office area of the number 13 investigation team, after listening to Luo An's brief description of the situation, everyone present was very surprised. Lassie asked hurriedly, which state's case? Where did the case occur? It's very close to us, in neighboring New York State. Luo An stood at the front of the office area, holding a folder, and introduced. In March 1992, a female body was found on a beach in Long Island, New York, and the police were notified, but the police did not find the murderer. Later in September 1992, April 1993, August 1994, and so on, bodies of victims were found. Not long ago, on March 14, 2006, a body appeared on that beach again. So far, a total of 11 bodies have been found on this beach, which is not too small. X5. After Luo An finished his brief summary, the atmosphere in the office area was very quiet. Winslow, Chanel, and Michelle frowned, and Lassie and Mona looked at each other, their faces not looking very good. After a few seconds of silence, Lassie frowned and said, has the Long Island police in New York found no clues about the murderer? They must have found some clues, but they didn't take this serial murder case too seriously. Luo An closed the folder, threw it on the table, and said in a deep voice, information shows that most of these victims were young women working in the sex industry. This group has always been on the margins of society. If it weren't for the body that was recently found, which was reported to the police by several children who went to that beach to camp, attracting a lot of media attention, this serial murder case would probably have been suppressed by the Long Island police for a long time. Fouquet, son of. Hearing Luo An's words, Winslow and Lassie couldn't help but curse in a low voice. Mona closed the computer, and Michelle asked, Luo An, what should we do next? Luo An rubbed his temples, pondered for a few seconds, and said, let's go to the Long Island police first and retrieve the records related to the victims over the years, such as identity files, autopsy reports, and the situations described by the callers when they called the police. Michelle, Chinelle, Lassie, you are responsible for this aspect of the work. No problem. Michelle and the other two nodded in agreement. Roan then looked at the remaining two people and said, the area where the body was found has no surveillance at all, so we will focus on visiting residents in the nearby area. Mona, Winslow, you and I will go there to investigate the situation. Understood. Long Island, New York, is an island located on the Atlantic coast of North America. It is administratively part of New York State. It is 190 kilometers long and about 20 to 30 kilometers wide. The members of the 13th investigation team drove from Washington, D.C. to Long Island and split up outside the Long Island police station. Roan, Mona and Winslow drove to the scene of the crime, which was located on the side of Long Island on the map. The original plan of Roan and the other two was to go to the home of the person who called the police, to ask about the situation, and see if there were any clues that could be used later. But as soon as the car arrived in this area, the three saw a circle of people gathered around a bush area on the beach. Roan and the other two looked at each other, parked the car to the side, and went over to check. Hello, FBI. Taking out the gold badge to simply show his identity, Roan called over a white man who was passing by and asked, what happened there? The white man's expression was very surprised, and he explained, just now, when Una was walking her dog here, her dog pulled out a human bone in the bushes. What? Hearing this, Winslow and Michelle's faces changed, and they hurried over to check the situation. Roan followed closely, and squeezed in among the passers-by. Sure enough, he saw a human arm bone on the ground. At the same time, a yellow pet dog was next to the arm bone, growling and continuing to dig the soil. From the traces it dug, it was obvious that there were other skeletal parts of a body underground. The owner of the pet dog was a white old woman who looked to be in her 50s. At this time, she had collapsed and fainted on the ground next to her. Damn it. Winslow and Mona's faces changed, and they hurried to maintain order at the scene. At this moment, Roan's cell phone suddenly rang. It's me, Luo An. Luo An waved his hand to signal Mona to call the ambulance and the trace examination department first, and then asked, what's wrong? It's me, Chinia. Chinia on the other end of the phone said in a serious tone, Luo An, we found out that the murderer in this case is very arrogant. After killing someone, he even made a mocking call to the victim's family. Chapter 578, Serial Murder Case Spanning More Than 10 Years. Wednesday, 10:30 a.m., in a temporary office on Long Island, New York. Pushing open the door to the office area, Roan took Mona into the office and said tiredly, sorry, we are back late. Thank you for your hard work. Michelle immediately stood up to pour coffee for the two. Lassie walked out of the conference room next to her and saw that Roan and Mona were covered in dust and looked quite dirty. She asked in confusion, what did you do? Did you fall into a pit? No, but we dug a lot of pits. Mona picked up the coffee on the table and drank it all. She let out a long breath and replied, after we arrived at the beach yesterday afternoon, an old woman's dog dug out a skeleton in the grass. Winslow and I were going to ask someone to take the skeleton back for testing and then visit the person who called the police. As a result, Roan asked someone to bring several police dogs over. Hearing this, Michelle looked puzzled, but Lassie thought of something and looked at Roan and asked, do you suspect there are still bodies on that beach? It's just a guess. Roan put down the coffee cup and said helplessly, but I didn't expect to find anything. From the moment he drove into the beach on Long Island, Luo An found that the geographical conditions of this area were very favorable. First of all, the area is large, with a straight length of about 10 kilometers from east to west. Secondly, the trees and grass are very lush. Even if you drive on the road at night, it is difficult to see what is happening inside. Several nearby communities are not very close to this beach, and it takes a long time to walk, so it is difficult to discover what is happening on the beach. In summary, from the killer's perspective, this beach is an excellent place to kill and dump corpses. For this reason, after Luo An found the bones dug out by the pet dog, he had the idea of asking someone to thoroughly investigate this beach. After listening to Roan's description, Michelle's face changed slightly, and Lass's eyelids twitched, and they asked, "So, how many more bodies did you find?" "There are 9 bodies that have just been dug out on the beach, and they have been sent to the trace examination department." Roan rubbed his temples, his voice was low, and his tone was a little irritable. In addition, a nearby resident who often comes to this area to fish, was horrified after learning about this and said something. Behind the rock on the southeast corner of the beach, sometimes some clothes will be washed up on the beach by the sea, and he has caught wallets there before. We suspect that there may be bodies on the seabed in that area, and Winslow is leading people to investigate there. X2. After listening to Roan's explanation, Michelle and Lassie looked at each other in silence. Luo An poured himself another cup of coffee and asked, "Where's she now?" "She's in the trace examination department." Michelle replied, "The tests that the Long Island police conducted on the bodies before were very crude, resulting in confusing results and very low credibility. We can only take back the bodies that are still there and let the trace examination department do another autopsy." "Good." Luo An nodded and asked, "Have you got back the information of the victims?" "All in the conference room." After a short break, several people walked into the conference room. Lassie took a whiteboard, pasted 11 photos on it, and introduced, arranged from the time the bodies were found. The names and ages of the 11 victims are: Ellie, female, 20 years old; Claire, female, 19 years old; Laura, female, 25 years old; Charles, male, 21 years old; Selena, female, 20 years old; James, male, 30 years old; Kate, female, 22 years old; Mandy, female, 26 years old; Jerome, male, 18 years old; Sophia, female, 22 years old; Langrucia, female, 24 years old. Seeing the photo of the man on the whiteboard, Mona was a little surprised. "There are 3 more men?" "Yes." Lassie nodded, then found the photos of the 3 male bodies when they were discovered, distributed them to Roan, Mona and Michelle, and explained, among the 3 men, the first male deceased, Charles, was wearing women's clothing when he died, and his makeup and dress were also feminine. As for the second deceased, James, and the third deceased, Jerome, they were wearing normal men's clothing. Looking at the photo of the first male deceased, Charles, Mona frowned and pushed it aside, looked at Roan, and said, "These are 11 bodies, 11 victims. Together with the 9 bodies we just found, there are 20 victims on this beach. Don't forget one thing, Mona." Roan put down the photo in his hand, pulled the corner of his mouth, and said, "Winslow is still busy with people on the beach. Maybe he has a surprise over there." "Fouquet." Mona's mouth twitched, and she couldn't help but curse in a low voice. Roan then looked at Lassie and asked, "What were the jobs and occupations of these 11 victims before they died?" Lassie dug out a folder and introduced, Ellie, a sex worker before she died; Claire, a sex worker; Laura, a sex worker; Charles, can't be found; Selena, a sex worker; James, can't be found; Kate, a sex worker; Mandy, can't be found; Jerome, can't be found; Sophia, a sex worker; Langrucia, a sex worker. There are too many people. I can't remember them all by just introducing them. Roan got up from his chair, took the file from Lassie's hand, and wrote the information of all the 11 victims under the photos on the whiteboard. Mona looked at Lassie in confusion and asked, "What does the can't be found above mean?" "It means exactly what it says. Lassie sat on a chair beside the conference table, handed a folder to Mona, and explained, "There are 3 main reasons why we can't find any information. First, the victims were killed too long ago, and the Long Island police did not conduct a detailed investigation of a lot of information at the time, and now we can't find it. Second, these victims are almost all single people, without many relatives or friends, so it is difficult to find out what their jobs are. Third, some of the victims do have relatives and friends, but these relatives and friends either have a general relationship with the victims and don't know what the victims did when they were alive, or these relatives and friends have left New York State, or even left this world due to illness, accidents, etc. So we can't find any relevant information. This is really..." Looking at the information in her hand, Mona felt very tense and felt very painful. At this moment, Luo An suddenly said, "Michelle, please take a moment to find someone to borrow another 3 whiteboards." Mona and Lassie looked up at Luo An and found that there were only 6 photos of the victims on the whiteboard in front of the conference table. With the information written by Luo An, there was no empty space on the entire whiteboard. "I'll go right away." Michelle nodded and quickly got up and left the meeting room. Looking at the densely packed text messages on the whiteboard and the photos of the 5 victims whose information had not yet been sorted out, Mona felt her scalp tingling. After pondering for a few seconds, she whispered, "Roan, why don't you call Verinus and ask her to send some people to help? The call must be made, but not now." Roan shook his head, squinted at the information on the whiteboard, and said, "I seem to have found some interesting clues." Mona and Lassie's eyes lit up, and just as they were about to ask questions, Roan's cell phone suddenly rang. "I'm Roan. It's me, Winslow." Hearing Winslow's voice on the other end of the phone, Mona and Lassie both perked up, and Roan said, "I hope you can tell me some good news, such as there is nothing on the seabed and you have worked in vain." "I hope so too." By the beach, Winslow looked at the items just pulled out by the divers, smiled bitterly, and said, "We found 2 bodies on the seabed." Mona and Lassie closed their eyes and covered their foreheads with their hands when they heard this. Roan rubbed his temple helplessly and asked, "How is the body decaying? Can we roughly determine the time when the victim was killed?" Before Winslow could answer, Mona's cell phone suddenly rang. She pressed the answer button and found that it was Chinia. "Mona, call Roan." "No, you all need to come to the autopsy room." Chapter 579, Serial Murder Case, X2. Trace Examination Department, Autopsy Room. This autopsy room is not very big, and there are not many forensic doctors. On weekdays, they can handle 2 to 5 bodies at most at the same time. Today's situation is very special. Not only are there several people busy in the autopsy room, but there are also people coming and going in the morgue next door. From time to time, you can hear a few greetings starting with F. Luo An took Mona, Michelle and Lassie into the trace examination department and soon saw a tall, thin, and ugly white man in his 50s. The other party was the old forensic doctor of the trace examination department, covered. Seeing the other party coming over, Roan quickly smiled and stretched out his hand to him. "Hello, Mr. Coward, I'm Roan Greenwood. I heard about you, Team Leader Greenwood." Coward took off his gloves, forced a smile on his face, and stretched out his hand to shake Roan's hand. "I didn't expect that you would give us such a big gift when we first met." In addition to the 9 new bodies that Roan and Mona dug out on the beach, Lassie, Michelle and others had also brought back 5 bodies of victims who were still alive from the Long Island police. Considering the long time and some other reasons, 6 of the 11 bodies have been cremated by the Long Island police, leaving only clues such as photos and other physical evidence. That's 14 bodies, which were sent to the trace examination department within 1 day. In addition to the 2 bodies that Winslow had just found from the seabed and just transported here, it means that the trace examination department needs to deal with a full 16 bodies in a short period of time. Trace examination department. Roan understood that Coward and other forensic staff were under a lot of pressure, so he specially asked Lassie to send them some small gifts such as coffee beans. Because of this, although the forensic doctor Covered and others were very unhappy, they treated Luo An and others in a good manner. After a few simple greetings, they took the 3 of them to the morgue not far away. Walking into the cold morgue and turning on the lights, there were 2 rows of metal carts parked in the huge room, all of which were victims covered with white cloth. These are all the bodies you sent. Forensic Dr. Covered was the first to walk into the morgue and complained, "I have been working here for more than 20 years. It is the first time I have seen a situation like you. Team leader Greenwood, where the bodies sent at one time almost filled the morgue floor and the metal carts were almost not enough." Luo An smiled bitterly and shook his head. He had encountered serial murders in the past, and he had also encountered cases with many victims and many bodies. But this time the number of victims was 11 plus 9 plus 2, which was as high as 22. And the first victim died in 1992. So far, this case has spanned more than 10 years, and this is the first time Luo An has encountered it. I haven't asked for the identity information of these bodies. My students are handling it. You can go find them later. Forensic Dr. Covered walked to the first metal car in the first row, lifted the white cloth, revealing the slightly hideous bodies inside, and explained calmly, "The specific autopsy results of the bodies you sent will not be available in a short time. But during the autopsy, I found some problems with their cause of death, so I asked the girl to call you over." The girl that Forensic Dr. Covered was talking about was Chinia standing behind him. "Thank you for your hard work, Mr. Covered." Luo An nodded and asked, "Can you introduce the problem you mentioned? The cause of death is different." Forensic Dr. Covered did not waste any words and introduced directly. "The 12 bodies in the first row on the left hand side all have injuries in the throat bones, which means that their causes of death are the same. That is, they were all compressed in the neck before death and eventually suffocated to death." First row? Hearing the word said by Forensic Dr. Covered, Luo An's eyes moved slightly, and he looked at the second row of metal cars on the right hand side, frowning slightly. "Are the causes of death of the victims in the second row different?" "Indeed, they are different." Forensic Dr. Covered nodded, covered the white cloth on the first row of bodies, walked to the second row of metal cars, lifted the white cloth on one of the bodies, and introduced expressionlessly, "These 8 people all have a bullet crater behind their heads that penetrated the skull, which means that they were all shot from behind. In addition, the bodies of 3 of the 8 people are still in good condition. Tests found that there were signs of binding on their wrists, and their body movements at the time of death showed kneeling. So my students speculated that these 8 people were tied up with their hands behind their backs, kneeling on the ground, and someone shot them from behind." After Covered finished his introduction, Mona, Lassie, and Michelle looked unhappy, and a bad idea and guess emerged in their minds. Luo An's expression remained unchanged. He pondered for a few seconds and asked, "What about the last 2 people? What was the cause of their death?" "The cause of death of these 2 people is different from those of the previous ones." Forensic Dr. Covered chuckled, walked to the last 2 bodies in the second row, lifted the white cloth and introduced, "There is no problem with the throat bones of these 2 people, and their skulls were not shot. But there are traces of damage to the skulls behind their heads, caused by being hit by a stick-like object." Luo An narrowed his eyes, nodded and continued, "You mean, someone took a stick and beat these 2 people to death from behind? The autopsy results are not yet completed. I don't know whether they were poisoned before they died." Forensic Dr. Covered the white cloth and said very seriously, "I can only say that judging from the traces on the body alone, your conclusion is temporarily correct." "Okay, thank you very much for your help." Luo An stretched out his hand and shook hands with Forensic Dr. Covered. After a few brief greetings with him, he led his men out of the trace examination department. After entering the elevator and pressing the floor button, Roan pondered for a few seconds and asked, "What do you think?" Mona, Michelle, Lassie, and Chinia looked at each other and were silent for a long time. Lassie said first, "I have a bad guess." "What guess?" Lassie swallowed and said, "We won't encounter 2 serial murders this time, right?" And the elevator was very quiet. Lassie looked at the expressions on Mona, Michelle and Chinia's faces and asked, "Do you think the same as I do?" Mona, Michelle and Chinia looked at each other and nodded. Chinia crossed her arms in front of her chest and frowned, saying, "Most serial killers have their own unique killing methods, and over time, they develop a habit that is exclusive to them. Some serial killers are even proud of it. Some of the bodies in the morgue just now died of suffocation, and some died of gunshots to the back of the head. The guys who attacked them were obviously not the same person. Without waiting for Lassie to speak, Ron added, "Also, don't forget the 2 victims who were killed with sticks." The elevator door opened, and several people walked out one after another. Mona said with a grim expression, "So, this is actually 3 serial murders?" Everyone walked into the office area. When Luo An was thinking about the case, Lassie suddenly said with a strange expression, "Isn't Winslow back yet? How about asking him to continue searching on the beach? He only led people to search a small area and found 2 new bodies. The beach is so long. If we continue to search a little bit, maybe there will be new discoveries." XN. When several people heard this, they looked at Lassie speechlessly. Luo An threw a bag of snacks to her to cover her mouth, looked at Chinya, and asked, "You said before that the murderer was very arrogant after being found. What exactly happened? If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels." Chapter 580. Naming of the 3 cases and victims information. Wednesday, 12:30 p.m. in a temporary office on Long Island, New York. Hearing Luo An's question, Chinya found a folder on her desk and explained, when the Long Island police were investigating the information of a female named Laura who worked as a prostitute, they learned from her aunt that someone had called her aunt using Laura's mobile phone about 4 days after Laura's death. The voice of the caller had changed, and the aunt didn't know the other party at all. She could only hear that the other party was a man. The content of the call was that a man said that he had violently killed Laura, and Laura's struggle before death made him feel very interesting. So arrogant? Lassie frowned. Didn't the Long Island police investigate the man behind this phone call? Unfortunately, no. Chinya closed the folder and spread her hands. The Long Island police simply recorded this incident and went to investigate other cases. The victim Laura worked as a prostitute before her death. Her parents had died long ago, and her only relative was this aunt. But the aunt's living standard was also very average, even a little poor, and her relationship with Laura was almost non-existent, so the aunt did not ask the Long Island police to investigate later. After Janelle finished her explanation, the faces of the people present were not very good. However, this kind of thing is also considered normal in the Federation. Luo An pondered for a while and said, "Everyone, according to what the forensic Dr. Coward just introduced, we will temporarily divide these 22 deaths into 3 cases. They are: the first case, serial murder case of a person who was shot in the back of the head. The second case, serial murder case of a person who was shot in the back of the head. And the third case, murder case of a person who was beaten to death by a stick in the back of the head." Luo An wrote the names of the 3 cases on the whiteboard in the conference room and continued. Chinal, Mona, Winslow, Lassie, you and the trace examination department will investigate and bring back all the information of the 22 victims and simply organize it. Michelle, you go to the behavioral analysis department BAU and ask 2 experts to come here to help. Let them make a simulated portrait and psychological analysis of the murderer behind the 2 serial murders. Okay, no problem. The detectives answered in unison and filed out of the conference room. Luo An looked at the information on the whiteboard, resting his chin on his hand, and fell into deep thought. Not long after, Chinel, Mona, Winslow, and Lassie brought back the information of several new victims. Ellie, female, 20 years old, was a sex worker. Claire, female, 19 years old, same as above. Laura, female, 25 years old, same as above. Charles, male, 21 years old, occupation cannot be found. Selena, female, 20 years old, same as above. Kate, female, 22 years old, same as above. Luo An posted the photos of the 22 victims on different whiteboards in 3 groups according to the different ways of death described by the forensic doctor. Among them, the first group of 12 victims with damaged larynx and suffocation as the way of death, except for the guy named Charles who was a man. The characteristics of the other 11 victims were very conspicuous, that is, they were all young and beautiful girls working and sex workers. So, the murderer of the first serial murder case was a guy who specifically targeted sex workers. After looking at the photos and the information of the victims, the detectives quickly came to this conclusion. However, there was one question that Winslow did not quite understand. This man named Charles, what's his situation? Lassie made her own guess. Is the murderer a gay man? No, I think the murderer might have made a mistake. Roan shook his head and found a photo of Charles' body when it was first discovered. When Charles died, he was wearing women's clothes and had makeup on his face. In addition, Charles' appearance was more neutral. If the murderer killed people at night and the light was dim, there was a high possibility that he made a mistake. After taking the photo of Charles and looking at it, Lassie's mouth twitched and nodded to accept Roan's guess. Mona next to her turned her eyes to the second whiteboard, frowned, and asked, then these victims don't seem to have anything in common? On the second whiteboard, there were 8 victims who died of gunshot wounds in the back of the head. The first person to die was named James, male, 30 years old, and could not find a job. Next was Mandy, female, 26 years old, and could not find a job. Jerome, male, 18 years old, and could not find a job. Hazel, female, 40 years old, worked in a laundry shop. Hayes, male, 31 years old, no job found. Peter, male, 24 years old, works in a supermarket. Emily, female, 22 years old, works in a restaurant. Evren, male, 37 years old, no job found. Mona is right. Winslow also frowned after looking at the information of the 8 victims. These people are of different genders, different jobs, and different colors of skin, hair, eyeballs, etc. Except for the same way of death. It seems that there is really nothing in common. Luo An folded his hands in front of his chest, looked at the photos on the whiteboard, and pondered for a while, and said, the possibility of a serial killer killing randomly without a purpose is very low. These 8 victims must have something in common, but we haven't found it yet. Mona asked, what should we do next? Investigating a case is to unravel a lot of complicated information. For the second serial murder case, we don't have enough information yet. The first thing we need to do is to investigate and accumulate information about the 8 victims. Luo An threw the whiteboard marker aside, then looked at the third whiteboard and said, but the 2 serial murder cases above can be put aside for now. Next, we will investigate the last case, murder case of being beaten to death by a stick-like object behind the head. Luo An chose to investigate the last case first for 2 main reasons. First, the 2 victims died 4 months ago, which is much shorter than the previous 2 cases that spanned more than 10 years. Second, serial murder cases are difficult to handle, and the investigation will definitely take a long time. Dealing with a murder case of being beaten to death by a stick-like object behind the head first can prevent some clues from disappearing or being erased during this period. Understood. All the members understood Luo An's idea and nodded in agreement. Luo An didn't waste any words and asked directly, what about the information of the last 2 victims? It's much simpler than the previous victims. I have found it out. Mona tapped the keyboard a few times and introduced. The 2 victims who were beaten to death with a stick-like object on the back of the head are a man and a woman. The female is named Hannah, 20 years old, and a student at a university in New York. The FBI internal database shows that her mother called the police shortly after Hannah disappeared, but there was no clue until we found her body. The male is named Bloom, 43 years old, and a health robber. Health robber? Hearing this word, everyone present was a little surprised. Lassie asked, how could a female college student die with a health robber? This is the truth we want to investigate. Luo An patted Lassie on the shoulder, then looked at Mona and said, briefly introduce this Bloom. Bloom, 43 years old, was accused of rape many times during his lifetime. Mona pulled up the man's information, put it in front of everyone, and introduced, but because the novice police took early action to conduct illegal searches, the evidence was suppressed by the defense lawyer, and some of the victimized women were unwilling to testify in court and other reasons. He almost went to jail many times. Fouquet. Looking at the photo of Bloom holding his head high with a proud look in the case record, Lassie cursed in a low voice. Luo An pondered for a moment and ordered, Chanel, Mona, you go investigate the phone calls made by the murderer in the first serial murder case, and see if the relatives or friends of the other 11 victims have received similar calls. Winslow, when Michelle comes back, you and her will investigate the identity information of the 8 victims in the second serial murder case, mainly for investigation and organization. The 4 nodded in unison, and Lassie asked, what about me? You come with me. We need to tell Hannah's mother, who has been waiting for 4 months, about the news. Chapter 581 Good Girl Hannah. Investigation. Profile. Oh, God. In an apartment in a community in eastern New York, a white woman in her 40s, wearing dark brown clothes, was lying on the sofa sobbing. The woman was the mother of college student Hannah, named Amelia. When she learned that her daughter had been murdered, she instantly broke down. Lassie quickly sat beside her and whispered to comfort her. Luo An poured her a glass of water and whispered, sorry, please accept my condolences. Who is the murderer? As soon as Luo An finished speaking, Hannah's mother Amelia raised her head with red eyes and said sternly, have you caught that man? Why did he do this? The damn guy. Sorry, Ms. Amelia, we haven't found the murderer yet. Luo An shook his head and said softly, we came here this time to ask you for some clues. You haven't found the murderer yet? Before Luo An could finish his words, Amelia interrupted him and shouted, 4 months have passed. You haven't found the murderer yet? I looked for you many times at the beginning. Every time you said you were investigating. Now my daughter is dead. You actually. The layout of this apartment is very warm, and Amelia herself has a gentle temperament, but now that she has learned of her daughter's death, she can no longer suppress the anger in her heart. Ms. Amelia, please accept my condolences. Luo An was not angry. He just handed the cup of water to the other party and explained quietly, we are the FBI, and we were not responsible for this case before. I understand your feelings, but please control your emotions. After all, our top priority now is to find the murderer who killed your daughter, isn't it? FBI. Hearing Luo An's words, Amelia was stunned for a moment, then she realized that the person in front of her was not a New York police officer. I'm sorry. After a long silence, Amelia took the paper to wipe away her tears, cursed the NYPD in a low voice, apologized to Ron and Lassie, and said with a sob, we understand. Ron didn't continue to talk nonsense and asked directly, did Hannah ever tell you before she died that anyone threatened or followed her? No. Amelia shook her head, and Lassie continued to ask, did Hannah have a feud with anyone? No, Hannah was a very good girl. Amelia continued to shake her head, and after thinking about it, she added, but she told me before that she was dating a man who was older than her. Older man? Hearing this, Ron gave Lassie a look, and Lassie immediately took out a photo of another deceased, Bloom, from her pocket and asked, is it this man? I don't know, Hannah didn't tell me much. Amelia still shook her head and said, I haven't seen this man. Who is he? Is he a suspect in the murder? No, he is somewhat related to another case we are investigating. After asking a few more questions and making sure they could not get any useful information, Ron and Lassie left Amelia's apartment. They got into the SUV, and before the SUV had driven far, Ron's phone suddenly rang with a text message. Lassie asked casually, what's going on? It's the autopsy report of Bloom and Hannah, Luo An explained. While reading the text messages, the trace examination department conducted an autopsy on the two first, and the results showed that the cause of death of Bloom and Hannah was indeed the wound on the back of the head caused by a stick-like object, and the time of death of the two was also the same. In addition, there were no signs of violence on Hannah's lower body. Lassie breathed a sigh of relief, then frowned and said, so, Hannah and Bloom were both beaten to death with a stick by a person, and then thrown into the sea. Who has such a big grudge against them? I don't know, but we can go find Hannah's classmates. The red light turned green. Luo An put away his phone, and started the car, and said, maybe Hannah's friends will know who she is dating. The SUV was driving very fast, and the two arrived at a university in New York not long after, and found Hannah's roommates. After learning the purpose of Luo An and Lassie's visit, the girl named Alice, who had short blonde hair, a pair of large round glasses, and a book in her arms, looked very nervous, and kept looking around. Lassie walked to Alice calmly and whispered, "Alice, it is important for us to tell the truth." After a long silence, Alice looked up at Luo An, who immediately turned around and walked away. Seeing Luo An walk away, Alice breathed a sigh of relief and whispered, "Hannah has been dating our Professor Mullins." It was Professor Mullins who helped her get into this university. Lassie could understand the first part of the sentence, but the second part made her confused. "What do you mean by Professor Mullins' help?" Alice buried her head almost in her chest, and her voice was several decibels lower than before. It was Professor Mullins who wrote the recommendation letter for Hannah. You know, Hannah's family conditions are average, and she couldn't have gotten into this university without a recommendation letter. Lassie's face changed, and she instantly thought of something, and whispered, "What do you mean?" Hannah was still in high school, and she had a relationship with Professor Mullins when she was still a minor. Alice was silent for a few seconds, nodded slightly, and then added, "Professor Mullins goes to some high schools every year to give speeches and teach some free courses." Damn it. Lassie was furious when she heard that Professor Mullins used recommendation letters to lure and force underage girls to have relationships with her. Ron also looked serious when he learned about this and asked, "Where is Professor Mullins?" "He has left the university." Alice replied, "It seems that he had a conflict with the school because of some scientific issues." Lassie's eyebrows rose, and Ron asked, "When did he leave?" "About 4 months ago." Alice left, and Ron and Lassie quickly learned from the school where Professor Mullins was currently studying and where he lived. In the SUV, Lassie sat in the passenger seat, looking at the photo of the white professor in a suit and tie with a big back hair, and cursed, "What a damn bastard." Ron didn't say much, but silently accelerated the speed of the car. On the way, Lassie's cell phone rang. She pressed the answer button and heard Michelle's voice on the phone. She said, "The experts sent by the behavioral analysis department have completed the simulation portrait of the murderer in the first serial murder case. As for the second serial murder case, due to insufficient information, the simulation portrait cannot be made for the time being." Good. Luo An, who was driving, also heard Michelle's voice. He said, "Give a brief introduction." "Okay." Michelle picked up the folder and read aloud. "The behavioral analysis department believes that the murderer of the sex worker serial murder case should have the following characteristics. First, a white male, around 30 to 45 years old. Considering that more than 10 years have passed since the first case, the suspect should be around 40 to 55 years old now. Second, the suspect is married or has a girlfriend and has received higher education. Third, the economic situation is good and there is a second means of transportation in addition to the one used for work on weekdays. Fourth, the psychological or emotional state is suppressed for a long time." Michelle mentioned several characteristics in succession. Luo An's eyes gradually narrowed, and Lassie's face became more and more strange as she listened. After Michelle finished speaking, Lassie looked at Ron and whispered, "Ron, Emily seemed to say just now that Professor Mullins is about 57 years old this year, right?" Ron turned the steering wheel and drove the SUV to another road, saying, "I just looked at the school records, and Professor Mullins is exactly 57 years old this year." Lassie swallowed and asked, "So, do you think that Professor Mullins is?" "The probability is not high." Ron shook his head, and before Lassie could continue speaking, he stopped the SUV on the side of the road and said, "We are at Professor Mullins's home. We can have a good chat with him." Chapter 582 Interrogation. Questions. Profiler. The next day, Thursday morning, in a temporarily borrowed interrogation room in Long Island, New York, an elderly white man in a suit and tie with a slicked back hair sat on a chair behind the interrogation table. He looked at Luo An expressionlessly and said, "Listen, Mr. FBI, I didn't kill anyone, and I wasn't the one who killed anyone. I'm not the murderer, okay?" Looking at Professor Mullins, who looked decent and righteous in front of him, Luo An smiled and took a sip of coffee and said, "These words coming from a fetishist don't seem to be very credible." "I'm not a fetishist." This word seemed to be a switch. Professor Mullins flew into a rage when he heard it. He slammed the interrogation table with both hands and shouted, "You are slandering. It's libel. I'm going to sue you." "It doesn't matter, do whatever you want." Luo An grinned. took a folder from Lassie next to him, and said slowly, according to our investigation, in the 13 years since you started to serve as a professor, you have written college introduction letters for 16 girls and 4 boys. Are there any problems? Professor Mullen's face changed slightly, but his tone was still very tough. He said, they are all good kids who are good at learning. I will provide them with some help within my ability. Is there any problem? Don't make yourself sound as innocent as a white lotus, Mr. Mullins. Luo An closed the folder and sneered. Since we have started to ask you these things, do you think we have nothing in our hands? Yesterday afternoon, Luo An and Lassie arrived at Professor Mullins's home smoothly, but they were refused the visit by the other party on the grounds of no search warrant before they even entered the door. Lassie was very angry at the time. Luo An reached out to stop her and turned away, then led the detectives of the 13th investigation team to check what Professor Mullins had done over the years and talked to some young men and women who were sent to college by him with letters of recommendation. Among them, several young men and women were brainwashed by Professor Mullins to a certain extent, and they always believed that this was a consensual transaction. But there were also several older men and women who had entered society and understood the meaning behind that matter. They were also quickly persuaded by Roan, Chinia, Lassie and others, and expressed their willingness to testify in court. Looking at the folder pushed in front of him, Mullen's face gradually turned red. Roan laughed and said, Mr. Mullins, what are the treatments of those prisoners who practice fetish in prison? Do you need me to introduce them to you? I said, I'm not a fetishist. Professor Mullins became more and more angry. Lassie sneered, these people were all minors at the time. You use letters of introduction to deceive them and had sex with them. If it's not a fetish, what is it? I am. Professor Mullin's muscles tensed, and after opening and closing his mouth for a long time, his eyes suddenly lit up and said, I'm not a fetishist, I'm just a minor attracted people. People who can be attracted to children. X2 hearing the words that Mullin said, Lassie's coldness on her face became more serious. Roan grinned, you are worthy of being a professor. You can create a special term for yourself so quickly. Just as Mullins was about to speak, Roan interrupted him one step ahead and said coldly, Mr. Mullins, there is no need to argue about who you are. The jury, the judge, and the prisoners in the prison will have their own judgment. Let's focus on Hannah's case. According to the investigation, not long after she disappeared and died, you left the university where she was and went to another university to work. Isn't this too coincidental? Professor Mullins opened his mouth, was silent for a long time, and said seriously, listen, Mr. and Ms. Agent, I do know some clues about Hannah's disappearance and murder. But I really didn't kill her, and I really don't practice G-fetishism. Roan ignored Professor Mullins's last sentence and asked directly, what clues do you know? Professor Mullins spread his hands. I ask for an immunity agreement. Then you just sit here. Lassie sneered, and Roan stood up from the chair. I will send someone to take you to the prison. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. Professor Mullins waved his hands hurriedly and said, we can talk. There's nothing to talk about, Mr. Mullins. Roan picked up the coffee cup on the table and drank it all. He looked at Mullins coldly and said, you have 2 choices. 1. You don't say anything. I will ask someone to send you to the temporary detention prison. 2. Tell me all the clues you know. Roan and Mullins looked at each other for a moment. Mullins lowered his head first and said, 4 months ago, Hannah took the initiative to contact me and ask me to go out for dinner after get off work. When I arrived at the door of the restaurant, I found Hannah sitting in a car and chatting with a man. I wanted to call Hannah to ask if she had arrived and find out the situation indirectly, but Hannah called me first and said that she had something urgent to do and that the meal would be eaten another day. Without waiting for my answer, Hannah hung up the phone first, and then the man drove her away from the restaurant. As for the real reason why Mullins transferred to another school later, it was actually because he used recommendation letters to lure and deceive others. Someone on the university board found out, and he was expelled from the university. After Mullins finished the narration, Lassie frowned, while Roan remained calm. He took out a photo of the robber Bloom from his pocket and asked, is that the man you saw? Mullins took the photo and looked at it, nodding his head, yes, that's him. After getting Mullen's affirmative answer, Lassie was even more confused. She couldn't understand why Hannah got into Bloom's car and why she went with him. Roan asked about the specific time of the night, as well as the name and location of the restaurant, and then stood up and led Lassie out of the interrogation room. Walking into the office area, Roan handed the interrogation record to Mona and said, "Mona, this is the last recorded appearance of Hannah before she disappeared and died. You can carefully check the surveillance near this restaurant to see if you can find out where the car went afterwards." "Okay, leave it to me." Mona nodded heavily in agreement, turned around and walked to her seat and started typing on the keyboard. At the same time, Michelle came over with a white woman who was wearing an FBI standard suit, was a head shorter than Roan, had a ponytail, had a round face, and looked to be in her 30s. "This is team leader Luo An from our investigation team number 13. Luo An extended his hand to the other party and shook hands. Michelle introduced them to each other. "Team leader, this is Anne Murray, a professional profiler from the behavioral analysis department." "Hello, Ms. Murray. Just call me Anne." Anne smiled on her round face and said, "I have heard that team leader Luo An from investigation team number 13 is handsome and good at solving cases. Today I finally have the opportunity to meet him. Thank you for the compliment." Luo An smiled. The two shook hands and exchanged a few simple pleasantries. Luo An brought the topic to business and asked, "Annie, what do you think of the murderers of the two serial murders? For the work of profiling, the more information you investigate, the more specific the description I can give." Anne smiled and said, "I have already given my judgment on the murderer of the first serial murder case. But for the second serial murder case, I'm sorry, you have too few clues and I can't make an accurate judgment." "Understandable." Luo An nodded, looked at Michelle and asked, "Winslow and Chanel, how is the investigation going?" "We are back." At this moment, Winslow and Chanel, who were in charge of investigating the information of the 8 victims in the second serial murder case, where people were shot in the back of the head, each carried 2 large cardboard boxes and walked into the office area, saying with a smile, "Just the right time. Thank you for your hard work." Roan patted Winslow and Chanel on the shoulders, and they walked into the conference room together. At this moment, Mona came over with the laptop. "Roan, I found a suspicious car." Chapter 583, The Sin in the Refrigerator. Thursday morning, Long Island, New York, a temporary office. As soon as Mona finished speaking, everyone gathered around. Roan asked, "What's going on?" Mona put her laptop on the table, pulled up a surveillance video, and explained, "This is the surveillance video of the restaurant Mullins mentioned. In the surveillance video, everyone clearly saw Hannah and Bloom standing together and talking, and then Hannah got into Bloom's car. Then Bloom started the car and left the restaurant. As soon as the car left, a black car diagonally opposite the restaurant door immediately started and left. I didn't notice the black car at first." Mona tapped on the keyboard a few times, calling up another surveillance video, and said, "The second video is a surveillance video of an intersection not far from the restaurant. Bloom was driving Hannah through this intersection, and the black car followed them again. Someone was actually following a rapist." Lassie narrowed her eyes and guessed, "Seeking revenge on Bloom?" "It's possible." Winslow nodded seriously. Roan asked, "Can you find out who the owner of this black car is?" "Of course, I found out." Mona said it was a trivial matter and pulled down the computer page. A photo of a middle-aged white woman appeared in front of everyone. She introduced Josephine, 41 years old, unemployed, no criminal record, and no tax record. Looking at the photo of the white woman with messy brown hair, slightly bulging eyes, dull eyes, and a thin figure, everyone frowned. Everyone present had seen what a drug addict looked like, and they could tell at a glance that Josephine had obviously eaten flour. Luo An was silent for a moment, then asked, "Has this Josephine had any connection with Bloom?" "Of course." Mona nodded heavily and said, "In fact, according to the information, Bloom sold this car of Josephine to her at a low price. In addition, a patrol record of the NYPD shows that Bloom once reported a case that someone had stolen things from his home. When the patrol arrived at Bloom's residence later, he found the suspicious Josephine, but Bloom later cancelled the call and said it was a misunderstanding. He didn't lose anything, but just saw it wrong. What a strange thing. Lassie scratched her head and said, why do I feel that the whole thing is full of questions? If the murderer is Josephine, why did she kill Hannah? Did she fail? Bring her back and ask her and you'll know. Luo An patted Mona on the shoulder and said, where does this Josephine live now? There is very little useful information about her, and there is no way to find out where she lives. Mona frowned slightly, tapped the keyboard for a while, and said, but this black car just filled up with gas a few days ago. Maybe we can get Josephine's address from that gas station. Good. Luo An nodded with satisfaction and ordered, Mona, Winslow, Michelle, stay in the office and help Ms. An analyze the murderer of the second serial murder case. Lassie, Chanel, come with me. We will go to that gas station to fill up the SUV. Understood. An hour later, Luo An and his two friends arrived at the gas station smoothly. When the staff was refueling the SUV, Luo An learned from the other party that the owner of the black car lived nearby. However, he didn't know the exact location, so he suggested that Luo An and his two friends go to the laundry shop not far away to ask where the flow of people is the largest, and maybe there will be gains. After the SUV was filled with gas, the staff put the gas gun back in place and asked casually, what did that girl do? Girl. Hearing this word, Lassie and Chanel were stunned for a moment. Roan narrowed his eyes slightly. You said the owner of the black car was a girl? Yes. The gas station staff nodded and said, she looks to be in her 20s, with short black hair, very beautiful, and has two dimples on her face when she smiles. Lassie and Chanel looked at each other and saw the suspicion in each other's eyes. Roan then asked, do you know the girl's name? Sorry, I didn't ask. Okay, thank you. Emotional perception can confirm that the other party is telling the truth. Roan simply thanked him, led Lassie and Chanel back to the SUV, and drove away from the gas station. This girl. Chenia frowned and said, is she a car thief? The records Mona found did not show that Josephine had ever given birth. Luo An's expression remained unchanged. He turned the steering wheel and turned into another road, saying, go to that laundry and ask. Maybe we can find out who the other party is. A few minutes later, the three arrived at the self-service laundry at the intersection. After a brief inquiry, the manager of the laundry said that she did not know the girl's name, but she knew the girl's address, which was in the community building across the street. Thank you. After a simple thank you, the three walked to a very ordinary community not far away, and soon arrived at the floor mentioned by the laundry manager. The elevator door opened, and as soon as he walked into the 6th floor of the building, Luo An's face changed slightly, and he took out the Glock 18 from his waist. Chenia and Lassie saw this, and their faces changed. They hurriedly took out their weapons, and asked in a low voice, what's wrong? There is a smell of blood. Luo An's nose wing moved slightly. The moment the elevator door opened just now, a faint smell of blood broke into his nostrils. The further they walked, the stronger the smell became. When they reached a door, Luo An was sure that the smell came from this room. Lassie frowned slightly. Why don't I smell anything? Luo An patted Lassie's shoulder. Chenia, who was next to him, looked at the house number on the room. Her face changed slightly, and she whispered, Roan, this is a room where the girl the laundry manager said lives. The three of them were armed. 2 on the left, and 1 on the right, ready on both sides of the door. They knocked on the door a few times, and when no one answered, they stopped talking nonsense, and kicked the door open and rushed in. After entering the room, the three immediately dispersed to the left and right, carefully checking each room with weapons. Chenia shouted first, the left bedroom is safe. Lassie's voice followed quickly, the kitchen is safe. Howlixie, what's wrong? Hearing Lassie's surprised shout, Chenia's face changed, and she quickly ran out of the bedroom and rushed to the kitchen, and then found Lassie standing in front of the refrigerator in the kitchen in a daze. Following Lassie's gaze, I saw a human head frozen in a large block of ice in the open refrigerator. The head had a female face. It was frozen in the ice with wide eyes and a big mouth. It was staring at Lassie and Chenia outside the refrigerator. Roan also heard the sound and came over. When he saw the female head in the ice, his expression remained unchanged. He observed it carefully for a few seconds and frowned, saying, it's Josephine. Then Roan looked at Lassie, took her arm, and walked to the side, whispering, "You should take a break." "Sorry." Lassie raised her hand to support her forehead, and walked to the side, whispering, "I need to slow down." Lassie was not afraid of corpses, nor was she afraid of fighting a life and death battle with an enemy with a gun. But Lassie was easily frightened by dismembered corpses, especially when she suddenly found a dismembered corpse. In the past, when they were still in the number 5 investigation team, Roan and Lassie handled the serial murder case for the first time. When they found the dismembered body in the refrigerator, Lassie was shocked. Chapter 24, and took a long time to calm down. Roan still remembered this incident and understood Lassie, so he asked her to go to the side to calm down. Then he looked at Chinia and asked, "How are you?" "I'm fine." Chinia swallowed and shook her head. Because of Lassie's actions, she had already prepared herself mentally. Although she was also shocked by the head in the ice, she quickly calmed down. After confirming that Chinia was really fine, Roan breathed a sigh of relief and closed the refrigerator door. Chinia frowned and asked, "What is the relationship between that girl and Josephine?" Chapter 584, The Murderer. Mental problems do not mean IQ problems. They should be mother and daughter. Hearing Chinia's question, Roan took out a photo frame and handed it to her, saying, "This is a photo I found in the right bedroom." Chinia took the photo frame and found 2 women sitting on the sofa. The woman on the left had a haggard face and grinned reluctantly at the camera. It was Josephine. The woman on the right had short black hair, a delicate face, a bright smile, and 2 dimples on her face. It was the unknown girl. After returning the photo to Roan, Chinia's face became more suspicious. "But didn't you say before that Josephine had no birth record? We can't rule out the possibility that the girl was picked up by Josephine." Roan turned and left the kitchen, waving his hand to signal Chinia to follow, and said, "In addition, this is the Federation, and you don't have to go to the hospital to give birth. The Federation is a free and democratic country with a relatively simple folk customs. Giving birth is not a problem for the people of the Federation, except in hospital wards, trash cans, toilets, public toilets, and even on the streets. As long as they have a pair of scissors, they can show what the miracle of life is." After hearing Roan's answer, Chinia's face turned ugly when she thought of similar incidents. She followed Roan into the right bedroom, and she came to her senses and asked, "What did you find?" "Look in the bathroom." Roan pushed the door and walked into the bathroom. Chinia turned her head and found a bathtub in the bathroom. There were many small scalloped marks in the gap next to the bathtub. Obviously, this was the place where the girl disposed of Josephine's body. Chinia was silent for a few seconds, took a deep breath, and asked, "What should we do next?" Roan took Chinia out of the right bedroom and said in a low voice, "Wait for the rabbit." I learned from the laundry manager that the black-haired girl would return home around 3 or 4 o'clock every afternoon. Because the door had been kicked down by Roan, and it was difficult to repair it in a short time, Roan led Lassie and Chinia to temporarily borrow the neighbor's room. After waiting for a long time, the elevator door suddenly opened, and the black-haired girl hummed a nursery rhyme, holding a bag of food in her hand, and walked slowly to her room. "Mom, I'm back." The black-haired girl walked to the door and took out the key to open the door. As soon as the key was inserted into the keyhole of the door collapsed to the inside of the room. Bang! Looking at the door that fell to the ground in front of her, the black-haired girl was confused. At this moment, Luo An, Mona and Chinia rushed out from the next room with pistols in hand and said sternly, "Don't move. Put your hands behind your head." The black-haired girl was stunned for a moment, then grinned, and then suddenly took out a dagger from her pocket, and did not attack Lassie and Chinia who were closest to her, but stabbed herself in the chest. Ding! The next second, Luo An moved extremely quickly, and his figure flashed in front of the black-haired girl in an instant, snatched the dagger, and threw it to the side, and handcuffed the black-haired girl's wrist. Looking at Luo An's handsome face in front of her, the black-haired girl smiled even more and whispered, "Hello, my name is Lily, what's your name?" A few hours later, at 8:30 in the evening, in a temporary office in Long Island, New York, the door of the interrogation room was opened, and a white woman with gold-rimmed glasses and delicate features walked out. She raised the folder in her hand and said seriously, "Team leader Luo An, your guess is correct. This girl named Lily has serious mental problems. Hearing this, Lassie and Chenia looked ugly, but Luo An remained calm and asked, "Can you give us a detailed introduction?" Of course. The female psychologist who was temporarily borrowed by Luo An from other departments nodded and introduced. This girl named Lily not only has a mental disorder caused by psychoactive substances, that is, paranoia, but also schizophrenia, antisocial personality disorder, and pica. Pica? Hearing this word, Lassie and Chenia looked puzzled, because when they arrested Lily before, the ingredients she bought were all normal food. In response to the questions raised by Lassie and Chenia, the female psychiatrist closed the folder, took a deep breath, and said, "But she ate her own mother, the Miss Josephine you mentioned." Lassie and Chenia fell silent immediately. Without waiting for Owen to ask questions, the female psychiatrist continued to add, "In addition, Lily also admitted that she did the deaths of Bloom and Hannah that you investigated. Lily was a child picked up by Josephine. Later, after Josephine met Bloom and had a relationship with him, Bloom also reached out to Lily. Josephine turned a blind eye to these things from beginning to end, and even joined in the play. Lily was full of resentment towards the two of them." Lassie and Chenia looked even uglier. Roan was silent for a few seconds and asked, "What does this have to do with Hannah?" Lily's initial goal was just to kill the man Bloom for revenge. Later, when Bloom and Hannah had a dispute, Lily took the lead in attacking Bloom from behind and killed him. The female psychiatrist replied, "As for why Lily killed Hannah, it was because Hannah and Josephine were very similar in stature and height, and both had brown hair. Lily hated Josephine just as much, so after beating Bloom, Lily recognized Hannah as her mother Josephine, and beat her to death. After returning home, Lily couldn't control her emotions when she saw the blood, and killed Josephine again when she was limp and powerless after sucking flour. But after years of raising her, Lily was very grateful to Josephine, so Lily kept Josephine's head, treating her as if her mother was still there, cooking for her, and accompanying her every day." After the female psychiatrist finished her narration, the air was quiet. Lassie's face was gloomy. Chanel clenched her fists and breathed rapidly. Roan looked through the glass of the interrogation room door and saw Lily inside smiling at him. He was silent for a moment and shook hands with the female psychiatrist. "Thank you, you've worked hard." "You're welcome." The two exchanged a few simple pleasantries, and Roan asked Chanel to send the female psychiatrist away. Watching their backs as they left, Lassie took a deep breath and asked, "Roan, what should we do next?" Roan closed his eyes, rubbed his temples, and said, "When the results of Lily's psychological report come out, we will hand her over to the mental management center." Lassie frowned when she heard this, but Roan looked back at her, his face serious, and said, "But what?" "Lassie, there are two things you can't forget or get confused. First, Lily just confessed that the murder weapon she used was a baseball bat and told the location where it was thrown away. I will ask Winslow to take people there to investigate and find it. Second, mental problems do not mean IQ problems. Lily is not a fool. She can distinguish between good and bad things for herself." Without discussing these things with Lassie too much, Roan patted her on the shoulder and said, "Lily killed an innocent person after all, and the rest of the things can be handled according to normal procedures." After entering the meeting room, Roan made a phone call, and everyone simply dealt with the follow-up of this case. After Lily was taken away by the mental department, everyone left the office area after get off work. In the hotel room, Mona finished washing up, changed into a bathrobe, and walked out of the bathroom, whispering, "What a sad case." Without hearing Luo An's answer, Mona put down the towel she was using to wipe her hair, and looked towards the living room not far away, where she found Luo An sitting on the sofa, looking at the information on the coffee table in deep thought. "Hey, it's time to get off work, my investigation team leader." Mona folded the towel into a square, covered Luo An's eyes from behind, and said, "It's time to rest. We'll talk about rest later." Luo An pulled the towel off his eyes and frowned. "The second serial murder case. I suddenly feel something familiar." Chapter 585 President. People who often kill people know. In the hotel room, Mona hugged Luo An's neck from behind, and squeezed her head next to Luo An's head, and asked in confusion, "What place is familiar?" Luo An touched Mona's arm and whispered, People who often kill people know that killing is easy and dealing with the corpse is the most troublesome. Mona rolled her eyes at Luo An. What do you mean? Do you kill people often? Luo An lowered his head and kissed Mona's arm and smiled. No, what I mean is that corpses are difficult for many people to deal with. I know. Mona nodded. She has also been involved in so many cases and has seen many case files in the past. She understands that what Luo An said is correct, but Mona is still a little puzzled. So, Luo An, what do you mean? Have you discovered the pattern of the murderer behind the second serial murder case? I just have some ideas. What ideas? Luo An grinned, tilted his head, and kissed Mona's pretty face, then whispered, I'll tell you. Mona's pretty face blushed. She hit Luo An's arm hard, turned around and left. You sleep on the sofa tonight. Luo An threw the documents in his hand onto the coffee table, turned over and jumped over the sofa towards Mona, and said with a smile, You don't count. No, what I say really counts. Mona sat on the edge of the big bed, raised her feet against Luo An's chest, and said with a smile, I'm not convenient today. Luo An was stunned by the action of grabbing Mona's feet, and frowned slightly. I remember the time is not today. Mona put her hands on her hips and said, It's earlier. It's not like it hasn't happened before. Okay. Luo An sighed, reluctantly put down Mona's feet, turned around and walked to the bathroom next to him to wash up. After washing up, Luo An simply tidied himself up and lay on the bed, kissed Mona, turned off the bedside lamp, and prepared to go to bed. In the dark night, Luo An suddenly frowned. Mona, what are you doing? What do you think? Mona suddenly increased the movement of her hands, causing Luo An to snort. She smiled and said, I just applied your favorite lipstick. Waste is not a good habit. Wow, I like your thriftiness. Luo An put his hands behind his head and closed his eyes quietly. The next day, at 9 o'clock in the morning, in the temporarily borrowed office, everyone continued to deal with the follow-up work of the Beat the Head murder case. Suddenly, Luo An's mobile phone rang. He pressed the answer button and found that it was Vereen's. Good morning, sir. Good morning. Vereen smiled and asked, how is the case being handled? Well, this case is a little complicated. Luo An walked to the French window, took a sip of coffee, and began to briefly describe the situation. That he originally thought it was one case, but now it has become 3 cases. After listening to Luo An's statement, Vereen's face suddenly changed. One serial murder case was already difficult to solve, and now it has become 2, and there is another double murder case. Vereen's face was as gloomy as water, and she said seriously, Luo An, I will. Fortunately, I have already led people to solve the 3rd double murder case. Luo An smiled, drank the coffee in the cup, and then recounted Hannah's case, and then asked, Sir, what did you say just now? It's okay. Vereen's rolled her eyes beautifully, her eyes shining brightly, and she was not angry with Luo An. After pondering for a few seconds, she said, do you need me to send someone to help? Not for the time being. I will call the commander if I need it. Okay. Vereen's nodded. Then she lowered her voice and said softly, in addition, Luo An, there is something I need to tell you. The investigation team you lead has a 100% case solving rate so far. I don't know who spread it, and now the president knows it. Luo An put down the coffee cup. This news did surprise him. Federal president? That's right. Vereen said in a serious tone. Listen, Roan, I know it's an honor to meet the president. But the president's level is very complicated, far beyond the ability of people like you and me to handle. If the president's people come to you, you must not rush to agree, and you must contact me, or Mr. Clement, as soon as possible, understand? After such a long period of contact and work, Vereen has seen that Roan does not value power, but prefers money. But the Federation is one of the top countries on the earth, and the president is the leader of a country. The status and power are far beyond the imagination of ordinary people, and the promises that can be made are also extraordinary. So Vereen is very worried that Roan will be impulsive and accept the other party's orders without knowing anything, and be involved in some complicated events. In the end, he became a scapegoat for someone, and lost his life without knowing what happened. I understand, sir. Hearing Verine's words, Roan's expression became extremely serious and nodded heavily to agree. It doesn't matter who the current federal president is, nor who the future federal president will be. What matters is their stance and party. In 2006, the fight between the Republicans and the Democrats was not as intense as it would be later, but there were still a lot of messes. Luo An deeply understood the killing in federal politics, and he had always thought about using the things in it to move up. There were pitfalls everywhere, and the risk factor was too high, so it was not worth it. I'm glad you understand. Verinis breathed a sigh of relief, and the two chatted briefly for a while. When she was about to hang up the phone, Luo An suddenly interrupted her and asked in a low voice, "Sir, do you know who spread the rumor that I have a 100% crime solving rate?" "I don't know, I'm investigating." Verinis's expression moved, and she asked, "Luo An, do you have any guesses?" Luo An was silent for a few seconds, narrowed his eyes, and whispered, "Sir, Director Antoine of the Office of Professional Responsibility once invited me to dinner after get off work, but I was busy handling the case at the time, so I declined." Hearing the name Luo An said, Verinis's face suddenly turned cold, and she said in a cold voice, "I know, Luo An, you continue to handle the case, and remember to call me in time when you need help." "Okay, sir." After hanging up the phone, Luo An looked at the scenery outside the floor-to-ceiling window. A thoughtful look flashed in his eyes, and he whispered to himself, "Juice." At this moment, Michelle came over and said, "Team leader, the information on the first and second serial murder cases has been sorted out." "Very good." Luo An collected the messy thoughts in his mind and turned to the conference room not far away. "Let's deal with these two serial murder cases." In the conference room, the members of the 13th investigation team sat on both sides of the conference table. The professional profiler Anne Murray from the behavioral analysis department sat opposite Luo An. Michelle walked to the front with a folder, pointed to the 20 photos on the two large whiteboards, and said, "Everyone, the murderer of the serial murder case on the left has always targeted women who work in the field, and a man dressed as a woman. I won't say more here. For the second serial murder case on the right, where the victim was shot in the back of the head, here are all the information on the 8 victims. But I'm sorry, we still haven't found any connection or common points between them." "No?" Lassie heard this, and looked at the pile of folders in the middle of the table in surprise. So much information, but nothing was found. Luo An closed the folder in his hand and said, "I have a discovery." Chapter 586, Speculation on the Murderer's Identity. Saturday, 10:30 AM, in a temporarily borrowed office or conference room. These are the personal information of the 8 victims in the second serial murder case. Luo An stood up from his chair and motioned for everyone to check the information in a pile of folders in the middle of the table. He took the whiteboard pen from Michelle and introduced James, male, 30 years old. According to the investigation, he worked in a chemical factory before his death. Next is Mandy, female, 26 years old, who was a store manager before his death. Jerome, male, 18 years old, dropped out of school to work in a watch shop. Hazel, female, 40 years old, works in a laundry. Hayes, male, 31 years old, is a sales manager of a lawn company. Peter, male, 24 years old, works in a supermarket. Emily, female, 22 years old, is a waitress in a restaurant. Evren, male, 37 years old, is a coach of a basketball club. These people are black, white, Latino, male and female. Some are financially well off, and some still have debts to pay off. Lassie was assigned a folder. She looked at the information in her hand with a frown. It seems that there is really nothing in common. They didn't even go to the same place when they were alive, and their deposits were not in the same bank. Thinking of what Luo An said last night and just now, Mona took a quick look and put down the folder and asked, "Luo An, you said you found something just now. What did you find?" Everyone looked up at Luo An. Luo An laughed and said, "My discovery is that there is nothing obvious in common between these 8 victims. X and the detectives present were all black," and Lassie complained, "Your joke seems a bit cold, Luo An." "This is not a joke, this is an important clue." Luo An put away the smile on his face and said seriously, "Everyone, Since we came into contact with this case, we have always focused on the victims, trying to find the same characteristics or features from them, so as to find out or infer the murderer's habits or goals. But the problem is that these 8 victims are of different races, skin colors, and social status. Some are immigrants and some are not immigrants. There is no useful connection between them. Chinia raised her eyebrows, understood Luo An's words, and said, "So, you mean, we should shift our focus to the murderer?" Luo An nodded, and Lassie was a little confused. "But, we have no clues. How can we investigate the murderer?" "No, the murderer actually left us a lot of clues." Luo An shook his head, found the on-site photos of the 8 victims when they were dug out of the ground, as well as the autopsy reports of the 8 victims, and said, "First, the autopsy report issued by the Trace Examination Department shows that the cause of death of these 8 victims was that someone shot them in the back of the head. Second, the earth pits, where the victims were buried, were all standard rectangles, 1.8 meters long, 1 meter wide, and between 1.2 meters and 1.5 meters deep. For victims with little difference in body shape, the length, width and height of the earth pits, where they were buried are very similar, and can almost be said to be exactly the same." Luo An knocked hard on the whiteboard behind him with a pen, and asked with a serious expression, "Everyone, suppose the murderer behind this case has both the means of transport, to transport the victims and the strength to dig the pit. He will also make the victims kneel in front of the pit he dug, and shoot them from behind, killing them in a similar execution-like posture. Who do you think this murderer is?" As soon as Luo An finished speaking, the faces of the people in the conference room changed suddenly, and they all expressed their guesses. Killer, scavenger, executioner, the executioner who thinks he is righteous, psychopath. XN. Hearing the last word, everyone present was stunned for a moment, and turned to look at Lassie, who said this word. Lassie raised her eyebrows. "I feel that I'm right. The possibility of mental illness cannot be ruled out." Luo An coughed lightly to attract everyone's attention, and then said, "At the beginning, my speculation mainly had 4 directions. First, the murderer is a scavenger who specializes in handling some things for others. Second, the murderer is a killer, and the 8 victims were all orders taken by him. Third, the murderer was a self-righteous guy. He saw certain behaviors of the 8 victims, and felt that they violated justice or religious rules, so he killed them on behalf of justice or God." The detectives on both sides of the conference table nodded in agreement with Roan's speculation. Chinia asked, "What is the 4th speculation?" "The 4th speculation is a little special. I just thought of it last night." Roan picked up a whiteboard marker, wrote a few words on the whiteboard, then turned around and asked, "You should all know the Brotherhood. Fraternity, a special culture of the Federation, is a form of society that organizes gatherings. Fraternities on university campuses have become the main place for students to expand their network and find job opportunities after graduation. But newcomers who want to join the fraternity are generally required to show loyalty, that is, to complete very difficult tasks, such as doing push-ups on broken glass, to prove their determination. This serial murder case is most likely not the masterpiece of the fraternity on the university campus." But when everyone heard Luo An mention the word fraternity, Chinia's face changed first and said, "Luo An, do you mean that these 8 victims may be the loyalty show link when a certain organization asks newcomers to join? Use killing to show loyalty?" Winslow's face also changed, and he guessed, "Some gangsters do it. It may also be some other criminal organizations with radical ideas." Luo An put down the whiteboard marker, crossed his arms across his chest, and said, "The main problem is that there is no connection between the 8 victims, and there is no information in the data that they have offended certain people. In addition, among the 8 victims, except for the sales manager who works in the lawn company and has some money, the income of the others is not high, especially the 18-year-old boy who works in the watch shop. He depends on the owner of the watch shop for food, drink, and defecation, and his pockets are cleaner than his face. Therefore, the probability that the murderer is a scavenger or a killer is not high. They probably won't make much money by killing these 8 victims." "That's right. That's the truth." The detectives nodded in unison when they heard this. Luo An's speculation and analysis were well founded, and they didn't find any problems. Chinia briefly summarized Luo An's speculation, and then asked, "Team leader, what should we do next?" "Continue to investigate and organize information," Luo An said in a deep voice. "If the murderer is an executioner who thinks he represents justice, then he must have chosen to kill, because he could not stand certain behaviors of the 8 victims. So we need to find out the behavioral habits and experiences of the 8 victims before they died. In addition, if the murderer is a gangster, a member of an organization with radical ideas, or some people, then this organization cannot be unknown, and they must recruit members. And as long as they recruit members, they will inevitably leave clues, and these are what we need to find." Well, after listening to Luo An's words, the detectives present scratched their heads. Lassie looked embarrassed and said, "Luo An, although it is a bit troublesome to check the experiences of the 8 victims before their deaths, it is not particularly difficult. But to check the information of the organization recruiting members later, we don't seem to have a direction for investigation at all. This kind of criminal organization must be very secretive. Without information about the organization and no one to recommend it, the investigators are completely in the dark and have no idea which direction to go." Luo An nodded. He certainly knew the difficulties involved, but he was prepared. Pulling out a familiar dark red phone card-sized card from his pocket, Luo An grinned. "The federal land is so large that it has nurtured a lot of talents. Now that we are facing difficulties, it's time to let them cooperate with our FBI work. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels." Chapter 587. Luo An, the suggestion is good, don't suggest it next time. The dark red metal card that Luo An took out was the identity certificate obtained after catching the taxi driver who sneaked into Luo An's villa and tried to find the cross. Seeing the dark red metal card, Lass's eyes lit up, and Mona sat up straight, refreshed, and asked with a smile, "Luo An, are you going to use that underground criminal website to find clues?" "Yes." Luo An nodded with a smile, handed a notebook to Mona, and said, "Not only this website, but also the criminal website we encountered earlier. I also borrowed a few identities from the intelligence department." "Wow." Mona took the notebook and sighed, looked down for a few times, and said in surprise, 8 criminal websites? Why so many? The internet is developing rapidly. Naturally, there are talents with long-term vision in the underground world. The intelligence department has been dealing with these things. 8 criminal websites are not many. Luo An smiled. He called the intelligence department this morning to ask for help. He thought that, if it didn't work, he would let Verines come forward. Unexpectedly, the intelligence department heard his name and agreed without saying a word. The intelligence department not only handed over all the 8 criminal websites they had on hand to Luo An, but also prepared 3 or 4 accounts with disguised identities for Luo An on each website. Luo An was very surprised to get this information. After asking, he learned that the intelligence department had also heard about the 100% crime solving rate of the investigation team led by Luo An. Knowing that Luo An needed help this time, the intelligence department was naturally willing to go with the flow and do him a favor. Luo An simply expressed his gratitude to the intelligence department, and his expression turned cold after hanging up the phone. It was a good thing to get help from the intelligence department, but the publicity of the crime solving rate behind the scenes, coupled with the previous call from Verines, made Luo An smell something wrong. So Luo An called Verines again later, and after a brief communication, Verines immediately agreed and prepared to deal with this matter. Putting these things behind his mind for the time being, Luo An briefly talked about some precautions, and Mona then took the computer and notebook, pulled Michelle out of the meeting room, and began to enter those websites to post and test the investigation. The 2 women left the meeting room. Luo An then looked at the other detectives who stayed and asked, "Everyone, how are the clues for the first serial murder case, which is the case against the profile workers, going?" "We found important clues." Hearing Luo An's question, The detectives immediately turned their attention to the first serial murder case. After searching the documents in their hands for a while, Winslow stood up first and said, "During the investigation, we found that among the 12 victims of the first serial murder case, the first victim died in 1992, which was too early to find relevant information. The second, third, fourth, and fifth victims were also difficult to investigate due to similar circumstances. In addition to these 5 victims, after the death of the next 7 victims, one of their family members or friends received a call from someone using the victim's mobile phone. The content of the call was roughly the same. The murderer claimed that he had raped and killed the victim. The murderer even described his feelings, which caused the victim's relatives or friends to curse." Fouquet, Lassie cursed in a low voice, and Anne Murray, a profiler from the Behavioral Analysis Department, nodded and said in a deep voice, "This is an obvious provocative behavior. On the one hand, it shows that the pleasure of killing others has gradually decreased for the murderer, and the murderer has begun to look for more pleasure from the relatives or friends of the victims. On the other hand, it also shows that the murderer is very confident in his own safety. He believes that he has erased the clues related to himself, and firmly believes that law enforcement officers cannot find him. A very rampant guy." Luo An narrowed his eyes and asked, "Have you found any clues about the mobile phone?" "We found some, but not many." Winslow handed a folder to Luo An and explained, "According to the investigation, the murderer used the victim's mobile phone when he called. According to the location where the signal was transmitted, we found a total of 3 base stations, which can be determined that the murderer was in a park in Long Island when he called. But there was no useful information later, because there was no surveillance in that park, and the flow of people was still very large. There were many men who fit the simulated portrait made by an profiler, and it was impossible to check them all." Luo An looked at the information in the folder and pondered for a while, then asked, "Have you checked the call records of the 7 victims' phones? Are there any suspicious disposable calls or anonymous calls?" "We've checked, and there's none." Winslow shook his head and said, "I suspect the murderer used the most old-fashioned method, which is to randomly find those women who work in the streets, and then use money to trick them into going with him. This is very troublesome." Lassie frowned and said, "New York is so big, there are probably more than 100,000 women working in the streets. Excluding those who are organized and have gang leaders, the number of people working alone on the streets is probably over 10,000. If the murderer really used the old method, driving on the street to randomly find people, according to his frequency of killing once a year, we may not be able to find him at all." Luo An folded his hands in front of his chest and remained silent. Chenier thought for a while and asked, "What if we also use the stupid method and ask those women one by one?" "It's impossible." Lassie shook her head again and introduced, "You don't understand this industry. There is a lot of traffic in this industry. If a woman is willing to work hard, it is not a problem to receive more than a dozen guests in one night. After all, most men are very fast. In addition, the turnover of personnel in this industry is far beyond your imagination. In addition to those regular workers, there are many women who work temporarily for a few days because of lack of money. After all, this industry does not require any technical accumulation. Some women stay in a certain place for a few days and then go to other places to work because of threats or fear of being seen by acquaintances. These situations add up to make it difficult for us to find all the women. Even if we find them, they have come into contact with so many men that they are unlikely to remember the appearance of a specific man. At most, they have some impression of the time and length of a certain man." XN listening to Lassie's serious popular science and explanation, Chenier and Anemo were all black. Winslow looked at Lassie with a little unkindness. He felt that Lassie's remarks about time just now seemed to insult him. Luo An, who was also a man present, looked at Lassie calmly, tapped her head lightly with the folder, and then asked, "Do you have any suggestions for how we should investigate next?" Lassie slapped the folder on her head and said, waving her fingers, "The murderer is very cautious and has never contacted the victims with mobile phones, so the mobile phone route is not feasible. If we go directly to the streets to ask, we may not find any clues even after a year of investigation. So, why don't we hand this case over to other investigation teams?" Luo An took back the folder, nodded, and said, "Your suggestion is very good. Don't suggest it next time." Lassie. Looking at Lassie, who rolled her eyes at Luo An, Chinia frowned. "Both roads are blocked. Team leader, what should we do next?" "I have an idea." Luo An pondered for a while, and just as he was about to speak, the door of the conference room was suddenly opened, and Mona walked in with a laptop, and said excitedly, "Everyone, Michelle and I found an interesting post." Chapter 588, Hell Joke. Saturday, 11:30 AM, in a temporarily borrowed office or conference room. Mona, who pushed the door and walked into the conference room, attracted the attention of everyone in the room. Lassie raised her eyebrows. "Interesting posts. Mainly some hell jokes." Mona put the laptop on the conference table to show everyone, and introduced, "For example, why do federals use metric units without millimeters in their lives? Because you can find millimeters in school." The expressions on the faces of the agents were a little difficult to keep. Luo An coughed lightly and asked, "Besides hell jokes, what else is there?" "There are also recruitment advertisements." Mona put away the smile on her face, tapped the keyboard a few times, and said seriously, "Michelle and I found some posts on the number 3 underground world crime website. These posts all come from one person. The content of the post always starts with a hell joke to attract people's attention. Then below the hell joke, there is a recruitment advertisement. The person who posted it has been recruiting meat rabbits." "Meat rabbits? What do you mean? Carnivorous rabbits?" Hearing this unfamiliar word, Lassie, Winslow, and Chinia in the conference room were full of confusion, and Luo An's face turned cold and said, "No, this word represents a living person to be slaughtered. Just like the gold-grabbing lieutenants in the Eastern world, there are many special representative words in all walks of life in the Western underground world. For example, human bones are called white gold, eyeballs are called flash, and women who have been trafficked are all called Amy regardless of their original names. The origin of this special naming method is hard to find, and the people in the underground world don't care about the reason for the naming. All they have in their minds and hearts are buying and selling." After hearing Luo An say that meat rabbit means a living person, everyone looked at him with a little surprise and astonishment. Chinia quickly realized something and asked, "Since the name meat rabbit means living people to be slaughtered, why is there recruitment in front of the post? Recruiting living people who are willing to be killed by others for money?" "Yes, that's what it means." Mona's face was gloomy, and she said, "The owner of this post said that he is recruiting people who are willing to be killed by others for a long time. The price is $50,000 per person. To show sincerity, the poster can pay the seller first during the transaction. If there are special identities, such as lawyers, doctors, motorcycle stuntmen, racing drivers, or people with special certificates, such as senior lawyer licenses, senior accountant certificates, etc., they can also increase the price within a reasonable range." Looking at the content of the post on the computer, everyone's face was ugly. Winslow frowned. "This kind of thing, it's not uncommon." Luo An shook his head. "Living in the Federation, having no money in your pocket, is basically like stepping into hell. Selling one's life for money. Some people who have lost hope in life, but have weaknesses behind them may not be unwilling to do so." Looking at the post on the computer, which has a bunch of requirements for the height, weight, no infectious diseases, no history of eating flour in the past year, etc. of the meat rabbit, the air in the conference room was quiet. Luo An pondered for a few seconds and asked, "Mona, the owner of this post is related to which of the 2 serial murders we are investigating?" "The second case, the shooting in the back of the head." Mona tapped the keyboard a few times, calling up another black-dominated page, and explained, "Just now, Michelle found a guy with the same avatar as the owner of this post on the number 3 underground world website on the number 5 underground world website. The two of us compared the 2 guys on the number 3 website and the number 5 website, and found that they are the same person." Chinia's face was serious. "On the number 5 website, this guy's also advertising and recruiting meat rabbits?" "Yes." Mona nodded, then scrolled down the computer page and said, "The difference is that a few months ago, when this guy posted a recruitment advertisement on the number 5 website, in addition to the previous hell jokes, he also included a picture." Mona pulled up the recruitment advertisement from a few months ago. The agents took a closer look and found that the content in the picture was a large rectangular pit that had been dug, with a shovel standing next to it and a bundle of thin ropes on the ground. Ignoring the hellish joke, Mona tapped on the keyboard a few times, brought up a red line next to the shovel, and compared the measurements to explain. The shovel that appears in the picture is the most common type on the federal market, with a standard length of 1.3 meters. Using it as a measure, we can compare the pit next to it and find that the length of the pit is 1.8 meters, the width is 1 meter, and the depth is 1.5 meters. It is exactly the same as the pit dug by the murderer when executing the victims in the second serial murder case. Luo An nodded, then motioned for Mona to zoom in on the bundle of thin ropes next to it, narrowing his eyes slightly. Among the 8 victims of the second serial murder case, the last 3 victims had signs of binding on their wrists. The thin rope inferred by the trace examination department also matches the rope in this photo. Chinia and Winslow were both excited, and Lassie asked hurriedly, "Can you find out the true identity of the owner of this post?" "Of course, but..." Mona nodded, indicating that she was capable of doing this, but did not start the action immediately, but turned to look at Luo An. Luo An immediately understood what Mona meant. Normally, Mona couldn't do it, but she could do it by hacking into the website. "Wait a minute, I'll go buy an orange. I'll make a phone call." Selectively ignoring Mona's eager eyes, Luo An waved his hand and walked out of the room. Mona's actions may have a bad influence on other law enforcement departments that are carrying out the mission and eventually lead to Mona being punished. In order to prevent this from happening, Luo An decided to contact the intelligence department first. The call was quickly connected. After listening to Luo An's description, the intelligence department immediately said that there was no need to go through so much trouble. After asking the name and number of the poster, they said, "We will soon be able to find out the real identity of this guy, and we will send it to team leader Luo An later." Luo An's eyes lit up and smiled. "Thank you then. You're welcome. Let's go for a drink together when we have a chance." "Of course. I'll treat you." After a few simple greetings, the two teams hung up the phone together. Luo An, who had become famous because of his ability and strength, felt the fruit of face for the first time, and the corners of his mouth slightly raised, revealing a smile. But many things have their pros and cons. Luo An's mind was full of thoughts. While thinking about future plans and programs, he turned around and returned to the conference room. "The intelligence department will send us the information of the owner of this post later." In the conference room, Luo An selectively ignored Mona's disappointed eyes, clapped his hands, and said, "Get ready to organize your equipment." "No problem." The agents in the conference room responded in unison, simply packed up the documents, and started to walk out. Half an hour later, Luo An's computer received an email with a photo of a white man and his identity information. Ines Heller, 44 years old, was imprisoned for intentional injury when he was young, unemployed, and lived in New Jersey not far from New York. Luo An typed out the information and distributed it to the agents, saying, Let's go and talk to Mr. Innes about his boring jokes." Understood. XN. Chapter 589 Suspect. Team Leader Luo An. Let's help each other. A county-level city in northern New Jersey, on a highway in the south. What do you call an 80-year-old black man? Answer, antique farm tools. In a speeding SUV, Lassie was sitting in the back seat wearing a bulletproof vest, looking at the post on the computer with a strange look on her face, and said, "It's a miracle that Ines Heller can live to this day, and was not beaten to death by black people in prison." Winslow next to him carefully checked his equipment and replied casually, "Those black people have a talent for comedy. These jokes may have been told by those black people in prison." Lassie turned her eyes away from the computer, glanced at Winslow, and smiled. "Your hell joke is not bad either." Winslow was stunned for a moment, and looked at Lassie with a puzzled face. Lassie smiled and whispered, "Don't you mean that all the people in prison are black?" Winslow was speechless when he heard this. Chinia, who was driving, gave Lassie a blank look through the rearview mirror. Roan, who was sitting on the passenger seat, shook the gun in his hand and said, "Stop chatting. Get to the target location immediately and pack up your equipment quickly." "Okay." Lassie in the back seat nodded, quickly put the computer aside, and began to organize the weapons. After checking the equipment on his body, Roan reached out and pressed the communicator beside his ear and asked, "How is the target person?" On the road not far behind the SUV, a black SWAT transport vehicle followed closely and moved forward quickly. Mona and Michelle were sitting in the car with several SWAT officers. Hearing Roan's question, Mona tapped the keyboard a few times and replied, "An hour ago, the target person went out to throw away a bag of garbage. After that, the target person has not left and is at his home." "Good." Roan nodded with satisfaction. The previous information showed that Ines Heller had no experience in military service, nor had he participated in military training or military clubs. Therefore, the action plan formulated by the 13th investigation team was very simple. Open the door. Arrest people. The two cars quickly arrived at the target location. This is a common wooden apartment in the Federation. It has 2 floors. The whole body is red and orange, which is very conspicuous. The area is not large. There are lawns in front and back, and 2 doors in total. There is also a small staircase in front of the door. According to the layout of the apartment, the SWAT team and the 13th investigation team were divided into 2 teams, each responsible for the front and back doors. A SWAT member holding an explosion-proof shield ran straight to the front door, and the SWAT member behind him was holding a door-breaking hammer. After receiving the order, he immediately rammed the apartment door with force. Bang! With a loud bang, the front and back doors of the apartment were broken at the same time. The SWAT members immediately rushed into the apartment with weapons in hand and shouted, "FBI! Drop your weapons. Put your hands behind your head. Go upstairs. Go upstairs." The detectives of the 13th investigation team followed and broke into the apartment. When they found that there was no one on the first floor, Luo An immediately led people to rush to the second floor. Bang! Luo An kicked down the door of the study on the second floor. A middle-aged white man in shorts and short sleeves and short hair in the room was terrified. It was the target person, Ines Heller. Hearing the voice of the FBI, Ines Heller had no idea of resisting with a gun, but was ready to clear the computer. When Luo An and others broke in, he was about to unplug the network cable and the wires. "Don't move. Put your hands up." Chenier and Winslow shouted at him. Roan moved even faster and kicked Ines Heller in the stomach, sending him flying and smashing him against the wall. With a muffled sound, Ines Heller's face turned pale in an instant, and he fell forward to the ground with a muffled groan. Chenier and Winslow quickly stepped forward and put guns to his head, while Roan took out handcuffs and handcuffed his hands tightly together. While Roan and the other 2 were holding Ines Heller tightly, Mona quickly ran to the desktop computer next to them, tapped the keyboard a few times, breathed a sigh of relief, then gave Roan and the other 2 a thumbs up, and said with a smile, "Almost there, well done." Roan stood up, raised an eyebrow, and asked, "Is everything complete?" "Some were deleted, but can be found." Mona motioned to Michelle and Lassie to help deal with the computer case and explained with a smile, "The operation was successful. Everything we were looking for is here." "That's good." Roan breathed a sigh of relief. Ines Heller had been picked up by Winslow and Chenille. Roan patted him on the shoulder and said with a smile, "I'm sorry, Mr. Ines Heller, you have been arrested by us for making racist remarks that violated political correctness." Ines Heller. In 2006, political correctness had taken shape, but there were not many cases where the number of buffs was used to determine who would take the top spot. So when Ines Heller was arrested, his face was full of doubts about Roan's words. It was not until he entered the interrogation room and heard Roan and Chenier start asking about the posts on the Underground World website that Ines Heller realized that the previous words were a joke. Across the interrogation table, Ines Heller was handcuffed to a chair, covering his face and remained silent. Roan took a sip of coffee slowly, and just as he was about to speak, there was a knock on the door of the interrogation room, and then Mona walked in with a laptop. Placing the laptop on the interrogation table, Mona looked at Ines Heller with disdain and introduced, "Team leader, I just found the accounts registered by Ines Heller on 6 underground websites in his computer. The content of the posts in them is roughly the same, or related to meat rabbits. In addition, in a secret folder on his desktop computer hard drive, I also found about 50 GB of children's pornographic content. We have caught another fetishist." Ron and Chinia were both a little surprised when they heard this, but before the two of them could speak, Inisella quickly put down his hands and said loudly, "I'm not a fetishist. Few people will directly admit that they are fetishists, I understand." Ron waved his hands and said, "Don't worry, Mr. Fetishist, we have plenty of time, we can talk slowly. Damn it, I'm really not a fetishist." Seeing the contempt in Chinia and Mona's eyes, and hearing Ron's words, Inisella's face became redder. After taking a few deep breaths, Inisella suppressed his impatience and said seriously, "Mr. Agent, Ms. Agents, I really am not a fetishist. The content you found on the disc is just a commodity. Commodity, understand? I make money from it, but I'm not interested in it itself." Chinia and Mona still had disbelief in their eyes, and Ron suddenly realized, in other words, you are just selling child erotic content, and are a disseminator of child erotica. You are not a fetishist yourself, right? Inisella froze when he heard this. In federal law, the crime of spreading child erotica does not seem to be much lower than practicing fetish itself. Inisella hesitated for a few seconds, and was about to continue explaining, but Ron waved his hand to interrupt him, motioning Mona to leave, and bringing the conversation to the point. After briefly recounting the serial murders on the beach, Ron pushed the photo of the earth pit to the other party with a serious face and asked, "Do you have anything to say?" There was another long silence. Inisella looked up at Ron and said, "Agent, I want to make it clear first that I'm just a businessman. Everything I do is just to make money." Ron smiled. "In other words, you know the situation behind this serial murders, right?" "I do know something." Inisella nodded, then shook his head and said, "But I can't say." Chinia narrowed his eyes. "Are you afraid?" Chinia thought the reason Inisella didn't say anything was that he was afraid of being retaliated against and killed in prison after entering prison. "I'm indeed afraid." Inisella nodded and admitted it readily, and then added, "In addition, I think Mr. Agent, I think with your position, you may not be able to investigate the situation behind this matter. How about this? I will tell you the identities of the buyers who bought the things in my disc, and you go and catch them, which is also a great achievement. As for me, I will help you catch people and accumulate credit for you, and you can also help me get an immunity agreement or a witness agreement to reduce some of my charges. How about it? Help each other. Everyone will benefit." After Inisella finished speaking, Chinia's face suddenly turned cold. She didn't think Ron would agree to the other party, but she realized that if Inisella didn't lie, there might be a big problem behind this case. Ron pondered for a few seconds, suddenly smiled, and asked, "Mr. Innes, you said you are a businessman. Then I have a small question. Did you pay taxes when you sold those things?" Chapter 590 Interrogation by Luo. Sell high. I'm a merchant. Saturday, 5:30 p.m. in the temporary office, the interrogation room. "Have you paid your taxes?" Hearing Ron's question, Chanel's eyes looked a little strange. Inisella was stunned for a moment, and then his eyelids twitched, and he stuttered, not knowing what to say. Ron made a look of realization. "That means I didn't pay it." Inisella's throat was dry and his face was twitching. Ron leaned back, crossed his legs, and smiled. "Mr. Innes, you don't want the eyes to know about your tax evasion, do you?" X to the word eyes. Everyone present knew its meaning. Compared to being caught by the FBI and finally being thrown into prison by the judge to play with soap, once you are targeted by the eyes for tax evasion, it means the end of your life. Because there are ways to survive in prison, but being targeted by the eyes means that you are not far from bankruptcy. In the free and democratic country of the Federation, bankruptcy is the most terrifying thing, because it means that life is worse than death. After Ron's threatening words fell, Chanel looked at him strangely. She always felt that there was something wrong with that sentence. Inisella's face turned completely dark. He hesitated for a long time, took a few deep breaths, looked up at Ron, and asked, "What do you want to know?" Ron picked up the coffee and took a sip. "The serial murder case on the beach with the gunshot in the back of the head." Inisella's face was stern. "Are you sure you want to know? Or, are you sure you have the power to investigate?" Hearing this, Chanel's eyes flashed with a cold light, but Ron's face did not change. She asked the other party a few questions. Is this matter related to the federal president? Inisella shook his head. No. Roan then asked, what about those big financial groups? Inisella's face changed slightly. No. Roan continued to ask, what about the army? No. Inisella's face became more and more stiff, and Roan grinned. Since he found out that the intelligence department was willing to sell him favors, Luo An carefully thought about his current status and value. Then Luo An suddenly realized that the investigation team he led had a 100% case solving rate, and he had the support of Verinus and Mr. Clement. In the eyes of many people in the FBI and other departments of the same level, he had actually become a hot, capable, and difficult to provoke guy. In addition to the absolute top figures in the federal political arena, big cheebles, big conglomerates, and relatively closed circles such as the military, even if he met some people like those in Capitol Hill, Mr. Clement behind Luo An would have a way to come forward. Then Mr. Clement used his political wisdom, ability, and connections accumulated over the years to obtain enough benefits for him and Luo An through some interest exchanges. At this stage, the main thing that hindered Luo An was that he was too young, which made it impossible for him to continue to move up in the short term. But if you think about it from another perspective, Luo An was just accumulating qualifications for himself during this period. When Mr. Clement succeeds in moving up, Roan's qualifications will be almost enough, and he can take a big step forward. After asking Inisella a few questions and successfully eliminating the answers he least wanted, Roan laughed, spread his hands forward, and said, please start your performance. Inisella was choked up. Seeing Roan looking at him with a relaxed face, he also became angry. He snorted and said, first of all, the bodies on the beach are not all. New York, New Jersey, and several nearby states all have similar body dumping sites. Hearing Inisella's words, Chinio's face was extremely solemn. Roan's eyes flashed with a thoughtful look, and his expression remained unchanged. He asked, so, this is an organization? Yes. What is the name of this organization? Inisella leaned back in his chair and said, I don't know. Snap, snap, snap. Chinio tapped the table with a pen and said unhappily, you know this organization, but you don't know its name? Isn't this lie a bit too fake? Luo An didn't say anything. Inisella said calmly, I'm not lying to you. I really don't know. I'm just an outsider of an outsider, or I can't even be considered an outsider. At best, I'm a meat rabbit supplier. Inisella said that he accidentally came into contact with this organization 5 years ago. He learned from an outsider member of the organization that they were willing to spend $200,000 to purchase a high quality meat rabbit, so Inisella became a peripheral supplier of meat rabbits. But the price of each person in your post is $50,000. Chinio sneered, 200,000 to 50,000. You are really shady. I said, I'm a businessman. Inisella looked indifferent, even a little proud. Buying low and selling high is a normal method. Otherwise how can businessmen make money? Waving his hand to interrupt the conversation between the two, Luo An leaned forward slightly and asked in a serious tone, do you know the purpose of this unknown organization purchasing meat rabbits? I don't know. Human trafficking, organ trafficking, biological experiments, killing for fun, all possible. Inisella shook his head, casually said a few guesses, and then said, I only care about making money and never asked these questions. But during a transaction, I casually asked the person who handed over to me how to join the organization. The other party told me that it was very simple, as long as I shot and killed a person under their witness. After Inisella finished speaking, the air in the interrogation room was quiet. Chinio was angry and shocked, but she also admired Luo An beside her, because the other party's words successfully verified Luo An's previous conjecture of showing loyalty. Luo An didn't care about Chinio's eyes. He frowned and thought for a moment, then asked, how do you trade with the organization every time? Do you have the other party's contact information? I only have one disposable mobile phone. Inisella said that every time he bought a suitable meat rabbit, he would use a disposable mobile phone to call another disposable mobile phone. The two parties agreed on the time and place of the transaction, and then they would exchange the money and the goods. At the transaction site, the organization's people would take away the disposable mobile phone in Inishela's hand, and then give him a new disposable mobile phone, and give him a new number. The new number of the mobile phone is also a disposable mobile phone. As for the disposable mobile phone used before, it will be physically destroyed by the organization's people on the spot, and then burned with fire. This means that every time a transaction is made, both parties use a brand new disposable mobile phone, and they change one for each transaction, and keep it for the next transaction. At this point, Inishela complained with a face full of dissatisfaction. The person who handed over to me was more greedy than me. Every time he gave me a new disposable phone, he asked me for $300. Damn it. $300 is enough for me to buy several disposable phones outside. Ignoring Inishela's dog-biting dog complaints, after listening to his narration, Chinia bit her back teeth, and was very angry, and at the same time a little doubtful. The means used in the transaction of the organization are so cautious, and the mastermind behind the control of the organization is definitely not ordinary. Luo An also realized this problem, but he was not panicked or anxious at all. Because most of the time, the top people's design is very good, but the people who implement it below can't do the expected ideas in the design. For example, Inishela just complained that the person who traded with him obviously used the disposable mobile phone stipulated by the organization to take the opportunity to extort money from Inishela. The leader of an organization that is willing to spend $200,000 to buy meat rabbits cannot care about the $300, nor can he issue such an order. This is most likely a small idea of the traders to seek benefits for themselves. And these small actions of the grassroots personnel are an opportunity to find out about this criminal organization. Then he asked some questions about the organization, and Luo An suddenly changed the subject and said, "Those buyers who bought the child pornographic content in your computer, please write down the list." Chinia was stunned for a moment, and Inishela's face turned black when he reacted. Luo An grinned. There is no reason not to eat the meat in his mouth. Anyway, they are all a group of tea fetishists. It is good for children to catch them. In the low curse of Inishela, Chinia walked out of the interrogation room with the interrogation record and the list, and Luo An followed slowly with a coffee cup. Lassie and others immediately came up to check the clues. After reading the interrogation record, Lassie, Winslow and others cursed, and Mona asked, "What should we do next?" "It's simple, call and find the boss." Chapter 591 Order to suspend investigation. This is the situation. In the temporary office, in front of the French window of the conference room, Luo An looked at the scenery outside and briefly described the interrogation record on his mobile phone. After Luo An finished his summary, Verines on the other end of the phone did not speak, and only the sound of shallow breathing came from the phone. As time went by, Luo An's expression gradually became serious, and he asked, "Sir, this case. Please suspend the arrests for this case." Before Luo An finished speaking, Verines interrupted him and repeated in a serious tone, "Please suspend the action for now, sir." Luo An narrowed his eyes and said, "I need a reason." There was silence for a few seconds on the other end of the phone, and then a deep breath came. Verines said in a deep voice, "After listening to your introduction just now, I remembered a case. I will send you the information of that case later. The reason for asking you to suspend the investigation is not what you think, but Mr. Clement is away these days, and the White House needs him. When Mr. Clement comes back, I will report this case, and then we will continue to deal with it." Verines' meaning was very simple. They were capable of handling this case, but it would be very troublesome for only her and Luo An to deal with the things behind it. It would be better to wait for Mr. Clement to come back and let him coordinate the things behind the scenes, and then Verines and Luo An would deal with the case. "I understand, sir." After receiving Verines' assurance, Luo An breathed a sigh of relief. After a brief conversation, the phone call was hung up. Luo An walked to his computer and began to check the information Verines sent him. The content of the information was not complicated. It was also an unsolved serial murder case, and the investigation record of the case, the so-called unsolved, was actually just a lie. The true situation of the serial murder case had been investigated almost completely. It was only because the things behind it were a little complicated that the FBI recorded it in the file. The reason for the complexity of the matter was very simple. The main reason was that the case involved the real largest organization in the Federation, the Church. Christianity is an important part of the history and culture of the Federation. Since the American continent was discovered by Europeans, Christianity has become an inseparable part of the social and political life of the Federation. The influence of Christianity on the Federation is everywhere. From the daily life of the people to the presidential election, the Church has played a huge role without making a sound. Many people say that the Federation is a country ruled by law, but when every president announces his inauguration, what is pressed under his right hand is not the constitutional document, but a thick Bible. Every time the president makes a national speech, he does not say "Lord bless the Union," but "God bless the Union." In the information that Varinus sent to Rome, the murderers behind the unsolved serial murder case were some pastors in the church. They brainwashed some people with some doctrines, tricking them into dedicating themselves, not only deceiving girls and boys to commit suicide, but also deceiving adults to sacrifice their lives and let others kill them, so that their souls can ascend to heaven. After all, the soul of a suicide victim goes to hell. And that other is naturally some guys who want to taste the taste of killing, but dare not do so, because of the law. In the unsolved serial murder case, some pastors in the church took money from both ends. On the one hand, the pastors coaxed believers who were willing to sacrifice their souls to be killed by others, and at the same time, they asked them to donate their wealth before their death to the church, that is, the pastor. On the other hand, these pastors also collect money from those who want to taste the taste of killing. Although you are helping believers to go to heaven, it is killing after all. Such voluntary killing resources are not easy to find, so you need to pay for it. You have to pay extra. This case happened 14 years ago. Although the case record shows that it is unsolved, shortly after the case was exposed, the FBI, for the sake of law, and the church, in order to cover up the scandal, have joined forces to arrest a large number of pastors involved in the case. However, because the action was not publicized, and the scale was not large, it was impossible to act at the same time, which eventually led to some fish slipping through the net. The incident happened too long ago, and Varinus had not thought about it before. After listening to Luo An's words, she remembered this incident, and speculated that the mastermind behind the serial murder case of Beach being shot in the back of the head was some of the fish that slipped through the net in this case that year. However, considering the complex situation and attitude of the church, Varinus decided to wait for Mr. Clement to come back, and let him communicate with the church before arresting people. After reading the information in the computer, Roan pondered for a few seconds, printed it out into a document with an expressionless face, then walked out of the office and said loudly, "Everyone, the action on this case is suspended." What? What did you say? Hearing this, Mona, Lassie and Winslow were shocked. Chenia's expression changed. Michelle thought of something, and asked hurriedly, "Is anyone trying to suppress this case?" Michelle used to work at the FBI Washington headquarters, and she had seen a lot of similar things. "No." Handing the folder to Lassie, Lassie quickly reached out to take it and check it out. Winslow and Mona quickly squeezed next to Lassie. Roan shook his head and said, "It's not that the investigation of the case has been completely stopped, it's just that the action has been suspended." After reading the information in the folder, a trace of contempt flashed in Mona's eyes. Lassie sneered, and Winslow cursed in a low voice. After snatching the document and taking a look, Chanel and Michelle looked surprised. Mona next to them thought of what Roan had just said and asked, "So, we will not deal with this serial murder case next?" Before Roan called Varinus, the original plan made by the detectives of Investigation Team 13 was to use Inesella's disposable phone to contact the traders of the organization, set up an ambush and arrest, bring the traders of the organization back for interrogation, and finally follow the clues to the source, catch all the guys in the organization in one fell swoop, find out the purpose and truth of their purchase of so many meat rabbits, and send the mastermind behind the scenes to prison. Hearing Mona's question, Winslow and Lassie looked up at Roan. Michelle and Chanel also shifted their eyes from the folder to Roan, wanting to hear what he said. Seeing everyone's eyes, Roan shook his head, grinned, and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I just said to suspend the arrest operation, but I didn't say to suspend the investigation. Arresting is arresting, and investigating is investigating. These are two different things. Their investigation team 13 has currently obtained a lot of useful clues from an seller and the documents sent by Veronith, such as the appearance, height, and car models of the organization traders. Since the arrest operation was forced to suspend, they will use these clues, together with those criminal websites in the underground world, to continue investigating the situation in the organization. Investigation Team 13 no longer follows the original plan of following the clues to arrest, but waits to find a way to find out the information of the members of the organization, the living conditions of the branches, etc., and finally catch them all in one fell swoop. After listening to Luo An's words, Winslow, Lassie and others raised their mouths and their eyes all lit up. Understood. No problem. The dull atmosphere in the office area was swept away, and everyone briefly communicated the existing information and immediately began to assign the tasks that they needed to handle later. At this moment, Michelle suddenly remembered something and said, Luo An, the trace examination department called you just now. Chapter 592, Discovery of the Trace Examination Department. Trace Examination Department? In the office area, Michelle announced the news, and Lassie next to him immediately came up and asked, Roan, what are you looking for them for again? Of course, to ask them for help. Roan replied casually, walked to the side, picked up his coat, and put it on, looked at the puzzled eyes of the detectives, and explained with a smile, remember the first serial murder case targeting street profile workers? Of course. The detectives nodded in unison, and Chinia said, there are no clues from the mobile phones, and it is impossible to ask those profile workers on the streets, so our investigation has been stuck. When Chinia said this, Mona's eyes lit up and asked, Roan, have you thought of any clues? I can't think of any clues. Roan shook his head and explained, but my idea is the same as the second serial murder case. Since we can't find useful clues from the experiences of the 12 victims before their deaths, it is better to turn our attention to the murderer himself. But we have already asked someone to do a profile of the murderer himself. Lassie frowned and said, while counting on her fingers, first, a white male, currently around 40 to 55 years old. Second, married or with a girlfriend, and educated. Third, financially well off, with a second means of transportation. Fourth, psychological or emotional repression. These profile information can help us verify or exclude suspects during the investigation, but now our investigation is stuck, and we can't find any suspects at all. No, that's not what Roan is talking about. Chinia's eyes moved slightly, and Mona quickly remembered something. She shook her head at Lassie, then looked at Roan and asked, you think there may be information left by the murderer on the bodies of those victims, right? That's right. Roan gave Mona a you-know-me look, coughed lightly, and explained seriously, ladies and gentlemen, in the first serial murder case, there were a total of 12 female bodies doing prosthetics, except for the first 5 victims, who have turned into bones, because they have been dead for too long and there are not many items left. The remaining 7 victims, although the bodies are severely decayed, still have a lot of things left. Previously in the conference room, several investigation paths for the first serial murder case were blocked. When the detectives were at a loss, Roan set his sights on the bodies of the victims. Later, Mona and Michelle found the post on the Underground World website. Before everyone went to New Jersey to arrest in a cellar, Roan took the time to go to the trace examination department and had a brief chat with forensic Dr. Covert. The chat was not long. Roan hoped that forensic Dr. Covert would change the order of the autopsies and put the autopsy of the second serial murder case with a gunshot to the back of the head at the end and deal with the bodies of the victims in the first case of the death of the shape worker and the serial murder case first. For Roan's face and the fine coffee beans in his hand, forensic Dr. Covert agreed without much hesitation. We will go with you. Roan finished his narration, while Mona and Chinia gave him a thumbs up. Lassie, Winslow, and Michelle all said that they would also go to the trace examination department with Roan. However, Roan refused everyone's request to go with him. After all, the work at hand was not yet finished, so he only took Lassie and Chinia into the elevator. Good evening, Mr. Coward. Good evening, Team Leader Roan. Roan shook hands with Coward, exchanged a few simple pleasantries, and quickly turned the conversation to the main topic. Forensic Dr. Coward brought Luo An and the other two into the evidence office, took out 3 transparent evidence bags from a large cardboard box, and introduced, "These are the clues we found on the bodies of the victims of the shapeshifters." Chinia took the transparent evidence bag and found a few tiny hairs in it. Lassie, who was standing next to her, was immediately refreshed when she saw this scene and asked hurriedly, "Mr. Coward, are these the murderer's hair?" "I'm not sure, but it's probably not." Forensic Dr. Coward shook his head and waved to a white man in his 30s wearing a white coat and black framed glasses on his nose. He introduced, "This is my student, Agent Javier from the Trace Examination Department, who is responsible for DNA testing and other aspects. You can ask him about these things." After the introduction, Forensic Dr. Coward had something else to do and left first. Luo An reached out and shook hands with Agent Javier and asked, "What's the matter with these hairs?" "We found them on the bodies." Agent Javier propped up his glasses on the bridge of his nose and explained with a smile, "No human white genetic material was detected on the bodies of the victims of the shapeshifters, only the dimethicone on the contraceptive pills. There were no other people's skin fragments or flesh in their nails. We only found these few hairs that did not belong to them on the 4 victims whose deaths were the shortest." Luo An nodded and asked, "Have you done a DNA test?" "We have done it." Agent Javier nodded. Seeing the expectant eyes of Lassie and Chanel, he showed a helpless smile, took out several test reports from behind, and handed them to Luo An and the other two, saying, "We found a total of 9 hairs, 3 of which came from a woman. We found out her identity. She was an old woman who worked in a community activity center. She was closely related to the deceased before her death. She left this world 5 months ago due to liver cancer." Looking at the report in his hand, Luo An's expression did not change. Chanel frowned, and Lassie was silent for a few seconds, then looked up and asked, "What about the last 6 hairs?" "The remaining 6 hairs belong to 2 parties, but they are not human." Agent Javier spread his hands and said, "2 of the hairs came from dogs. Our FBI internal database has never recorded dog DNA, so we can't find it at all. The other 4 hairs are not real hair at all. They are all wigs on the head of a doll." After Agent Javier finished his introduction, Lassie was a little surprised. She pondered for a few seconds and said, "This is really an unexpected discovery." "Indeed, I didn't expect this." Agent Javier looked at Lassie's face, smiled and nodded. Roan put down the documents in his hand and asked, "Are there any other findings?" "There are several other findings, but they may not be related to the murderer or the serial murder case." Agent Javier found several other folders, handed them to Roan, and said, "According to the inspection, several of the female victims had the experience of inhaling flour before their death." Half an hour later, Roan and Chinia walked into the elevator together. Looking at the flashing numbers, Chinia said, "This suspect is indeed a very cautious guy. We didn't find any clues about him." "Not necessarily." Luo An put his hand on his chin and shook his head. After a few seconds of hesitation, he said, "Let's investigate the deceased old woman and see if there are any clues around her. In addition, as for the doll, we will find a way to investigate its production company, transportation company, sales channels and buyers of the doll." This. Chinia was embarrassed. There was no good solution at the moment. After a little thought, she agreed. Not long after the two returned to the office area, Lassie walked into the room with a gloomy face. Several people in the office area immediately looked puzzled. It was the first time they saw Lassie's face so ugly. "Lassie, what happened?" Chapter 593, Organization, Situation and Information. "Lassie, what's wrong with you?" Seeing that Lassie's face was not right, Luo An frowned slightly and asked about her situation. "It's just a small matter, I'm fine." Lassie replied casually and sat back in her original seat. Luo An did not ask any more questions, but gave Mona a look. Mona nodded slightly, moved her chair to Lassie's side, and whispered, "Do you need help?" "No." Lassie shook her head and refused. Seeing that Mona was staring at her and had no intention of leaving, she was silent for a while and explained in a low voice, "Sorry, it's really nothing. Just now, an agent named Javier wanted to ask me out for dinner after work. Mona's eyes flashed with surprise, and then she covered her mouth and smiled. He wants to pursue you? Although Lassie usually has a capable short hair and neutral clothes, she basically does not wear makeup at work, except when she goes to bars and other entertainment places. But her face is indeed very delicate and her figure is also very good. The 4 women in the 13th investigation team, except for Michelle, whose face is not particularly attractive, have a special temperament developed from years of reading. Mona, Lassie and Chanel all have their own outstanding features in face and figure and can attract others' attention at the first time. Lassie picked up the coffee and drank it all and said unhappily, "That's right." Mona's smile became even more intense. Lassie is a lesbian and likes women. Many people know about it, but not many. Agent Javier's status is not high, and it is the first time to contact the 13th investigation team. It is normal that he doesn't know, so Mona patted Lassie on the shoulder and whispered, "Think about it in a good way, at least this proves that you are very attractive." "I know." Lassie nodded helplessly. In fact, what made her unhappy was not that Agent Javier wanted to ask her out for dinner. She had encountered such things before. What really upset Lassie was the look of disgust that appeared in Agent Javier's eyes when she revealed that she was a lesbian. Taking a few deep breaths and suppressing the negative emotions in her heart, Lassie stopped thinking about these things and turned to look at Roan. She said, "Roan, the ballistic test results of the second serial murder case with a gunshot in the back of the head have been produced. The trace inspection department said that it was another black gun that had never appeared on the market." "I see." Roan's expression remained unchanged. He carefully checked the documents in his hand and said without raising his head, "There is no rush for this matter. We can wait until we catch the people in the organization and keep them as evidence for verification and comparison." "Understood." Lassie nodded. The agents were busy at their respective posts for a long time and began to rest after get off work. In the next few days, Roan led Chenia, Winslow, and Michelle to jointly investigate the situation and information of the organization in the second serial murder case. Mona and Lassie investigated the surrounding situation of the adult offline and online. At 10 o'clock in the morning on Wednesday, in the conference room of the office area, Luo An received a call from Verinus. Looking at the scenery outside the window, Luo An chuckled and said, "Good morning, sir." "Good morning, Luo An." Verines on the other end of the phone asked with a kind tone, "Mr. Clement will be back this afternoon. When he arrives at the office, I will find him to describe the case. How is your investigation going?" "Everything is going well on my side, sir." Luo An narrowed his eyes and said, "We can take action at any time." "What?" Verines was very surprised. Luo An's answer was far beyond her expectations. She thought Luo An was still in the process of investigating the organization, so she hurriedly asked, "Have you found out the details of the organization?" "Actually, this is not difficult, sir." Luo An chuckled, took out a folder from the conference table behind him, and explained, "When we arrested the businessman in Isella before, we successfully asked him about the appearance of the person who traded with him in the organization. My team members led the portrait artist to draw the appearance of that guy based on Inesella's description. Using the portrait, it didn't take long to find the trader." Verines nodded with satisfaction and asked, "Who is that man?" "Ignacio, 40 years old. According to the FBI internal database, he is the owner of a small supermarket." Luo An looked at the information in the folder and introduced with a smile, "He has no wife, no children, no criminal record, and he doesn't even own a supermarket." Verines was stunned for a moment. "You just said he is the owner of a supermarket?" "That's right, but my team went to investigate on the spot. The registered place of the supermarket is actually a homeless gathering area. There is no so-called supermarket at all." Luo An smiled and said, "The so-called supermarket is just the name used by Inesha to pay taxes. Unlike the businessman in Isella who was arrested before, on the surface, Inesha is a very law-abiding federal citizen. He works hard, pays taxes on time, doesn't eat flour or gamble, and doesn't even look for women. He is very self-disciplined. But in fact, the place where this guy worked hard was the organization. When he paid taxes, he used the supermarket as the name, but he didn't have a supermarket at all. He didn't eat flour or gamble, because the organization had such requirements. He didn't get married or look for women. The reason for this matter has not been found by the detectives of the 13th investigation team. It is not clear whether Aneshal has a problem with his sexual orientation, or he is afraid of marriage, or something else. Verines then asked, besides this supermarket owner, what are the other situations of the organization? We have found a lot of other situations. Luo An then introduced, every time Aneshal traded within a seller, he drove the same small truck to transport rabbits, that is, to transport people. My team members followed Aneshal for a while and successfully found the small truck and the location of the organization. After a few days of squatting, we have a general grasp of the information and personnel of the organization. The organization has no name, it is just called the organization. The organization's leader designed a strict structure, strict and serious rules, rarely communicated with the outside world on weekdays, and the organization members and guests had a special way to enter and exit, making it difficult to sneak in to check the situation. But just like Luo An's previous guess, the top level figures were perfectly designed, but the grassroots workers were all ordinary people. Ordinary people have ordinary people's ideas. This is a free and democratic federation, and most ordinary people's ideas are simple. I work for wages. The monthly salary is so little, there is no need to risk my life. So after carefully observing for a few days, Luo An disguised his face and identity, and in a bar, with a glass of wine and $10,000, he got most of the information about the organization from a grassroots worker of the organization. Sir, this organization was most likely established by some lucky escapees from the church case 14 years ago. Luo An took the folder, turned to a new page, and said seriously, we found out that the reason the organization bought meat rabbits was to let their secretly recruited members experience the real feeling and fun of killing. As long as these members want, they can pay more to experience the taste of human flesh. There are special programs for grilling and eating raw. Those who are killed by the members will not be wasted by the organization. They have a complete set of extraction processes for hearts, kidneys, livers, corneas, etc., and they will eventually sell them on the underground black market. In addition, what else? If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 594. No one answered the phone. Hearing Luo An stop talking after saying otherwise, Verines frowned, quickly thought of something, and asked, have you found out the identities of those members? Not all of them, but I did get the real identities of some people. Looking at the head photos in the folder, Luo An's eyes flashed a cold light, and he whispered, for example, the son of a congressman in Washington Congress. Because he was worried that the call was not safe, Luo An did not say the name of the congressman or the name of the son. But Verines' face still darkened instantly. She straightened up and asked, Roan, are you sure? Roan grinned and said, if the person in the photo doesn't look exactly like him, but is his half-brother, or that person was thinner in the past, I should have checked his identity correctly. Without waiting for Verines to speak, Roan added, sir, in fact, if you hadn't called me first, I would have called you too. I think this matter may be more suitable for Mr. Clement to handle. I know. Verines nodded heavily, and after a moment of hesitation, she said, this information cannot be transmitted by email. Roan, send your most trusted agent to deliver the folder to the Washington headquarters in person. Understood. After a few more sentences of discussion, the two sides hung up the phone together. Roan closed the folder and smiled, pushed the door, and walked out of the conference room, looked at Chinia, and asked, where are Winslow and Michelle? They have arrived in Washington, D.C. They will arrive at the FBI Washington headquarters in about 5 minutes. Chinia tapped on the keyboard a few times, raised her head and answered quickly, then asked in confusion, why did they leave so early? Of course, it's just in case. Luo An laughed and patted Chinia on the shoulder. There are secrets in a place like Washington, but there are also no secrets. Many things can't be hidden at all. After Lassie found out the identities of several members through tracking the day before yesterday, Luo An realized that this organization has been in existence until now, and there must be someone behind it. In this case, the number 13 investigation team investigating this case may also be watched by some people. So in order to prevent the clues from being destroyed, and to prevent some other things from happening, Luo An found Winslow and Michelle before going to work this morning, and asked them to take the folder and go to the Washington headquarters first. When Veritas called later, the two had already arrived in Washington, D.C. Chenia suddenly realized, while Lassie and Mona frowned slightly, because the two had not yet arrived at the FBI Washington headquarters, and the risk still existed. After waiting for 10 minutes with a coffee cup, the landline phone in the office area suddenly rang. Ding-ling-ling. The impatient ringtone instantly attracted the attention of everyone present. Chenia and Lassie frowned, and Mona was also very nervous. Luo An's expression did not change. He walked to the side and picked up the phone. "Who is this?" "It's me, Winslow." Wins on the other end of the phone was in a good mood. Thinking of Veritas' stunned expression in the office just now, he smiled and said, "The mission was successful. Michelle and I have delivered the things." "Delivered to Veritas herself?" "Yes." "Good." After getting a positive answer, Chenia, Lassie and Mona breathed a sigh of relief. Luo An's expression remained the same. He simply praised the two of them, and then said in a calm voice, "From now on, the two of you will stay in the office area of the 13th investigation team at the Washington headquarters, and take a temporary rest there at night." "What?" Hearing this, Michelle and Winslow on the other end of the phone, as well as Mona, Chenia and others on this end of the phone were all stunned. But Michelle and Winslow soon understood the other meaning behind Luo An's words, and immediately nodded and agreed. "Understood. Okay." After the call was hung up, Lassie's expression changed slightly, and she whispered, "Luo An, are you a little too nervous?" Luo An so-called asking Winslow and Michelle to stay in the office area of investigation team number 13 was to ask them not to drive back to New York, as the risk factor was high. Staying at the headquarters and not moving can be a precautionary measure. After all, not many people can rush into the FBI Washington headquarters to rob people or commit crimes. The meaning of this sentence is not difficult to guess, and Chenia, Lassie and others understood it as soon as they heard it. However, even though they understood it, they still had doubts. Luo An patted Lassie on the shoulder, "Just in case, life is the most important." Luo An had simply put himself in the shoes of others and thought about it. If he were the boss or leader of the organization, he would definitely secretly record some people's murder videos. Later, the organization was destroyed by law enforcement agencies, and those who were threatened by the handle had only two options: either find a way to send someone to kill the organization leader during the law enforcement action, or find a way to stop the law enforcement action and send someone to rescue the organization leader. To be honest, Luo An thought the second possibility was unlikely, but Luo An was not sure that those who were threatened by the handle had brains. After all, people with brains would not go to that kind of place. Luo An was not afraid of smart people, but worried about those brainless guys. After all, he could not predict the other party's thoughts and actions, and who knows if they would rob people halfway. "Okay." Lassie was silent for a few seconds and asked, "What should we do next?" Luo An walked to the whiteboard at the front of the office area. At this time, the whiteboard was filled with information such as the organization base, members, nearby maps, etc., and it was also covered with photos and relevant information. After a few seconds of silence, Roan said, "Let's wait for news from the FBI Washington headquarters. In addition, how is the situation of the doll's hair in the first serial murder case going?" Lassie and Chenia did not answer, but subconsciously turned to look at Mona. Mona sat back in her chair and said while typing on the keyboard, "Michelle and I really found some things." Several people's eyes lit up, and they quickly moved to Mona. Roan asked, For example, Michelle and I found several suspicious people." Mona called up the photos of 14 men, pasted them on the computer screen, and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, these 14 men are all related to the doll. They are either employees of the doll production company, or managers of the doll sales channel, or have purchased those dolls. These people, how did you find them?" Lassie showed doubt on her face. Seeing Mona looking at her, she waved her hands and said, "I don't mean to distrust you. I'm just a little confused. There are so many people who have come into contact with dolls. Why do you suspect them?" "Two reasons. First of all, there is a profile record, such as white male, about 40 to 55 years old, married or with a girlfriend, and educated, financially sound, etc." Mona took the file from Michelle's desk and explained, "The people we found are completely consistent with this profile record." Luo An nodded and asked, "What is the second point?" "The second point is the hair of the puppy found by the trace examination department." Mona said, "The FBI internal database does not have the DNA of the dog, so the suspect dog cannot be found, but the breed of the dog can still be identified. The trace examination department determined through testing that the dog hair on the victim came from a Labrador. The 14 suspects that Michelle and I found all have a Labrador at home. One coincidence is a coincidence, 2 coincidences are accidents, and 3 coincidences are unacceptable." Luo An narrowed his eyes slightly, and before he could continue speaking, the mobile phone on his waist suddenly rang. Walking to the side and pressing the answer button, Luo An said, "It's me, sir." It was Vereen's on the other end of the line. As soon as Luo An finished speaking, Vereen said coldly, "Luo An, Mr. Clement has already known about this. The arrest operation will officially begin tomorrow." Luo An frowned slightly. He noticed one thing. "Why tomorrow?" Snap. Without waiting for Luo An to ask, Vereen's hung up the phone. Luo An's expression moved slightly, and he thought of something. He found Winslow and Michelle's phone numbers and called them. The ringing continued, but no one answered. Chapter 595. Action begins. Arrests. Emergencies. Wednesday, 11 a.m. In a temporary office in Long Island, New York. The air was quiet, only the busy tone of the mobile phone kept playing. Ding-ling-ling. The ringing continued, but no one answered. After a moment, Roan took the initiative to hang up the phone. What happened? The moment the phone was hung up, Mona and Chanel immediately came up, and Lassie asked anxiously, "What happened to Winslow and Michelle? Are they in danger?" Mona and Chanel also looked at Roan with nervous faces. They had the same thoughts as Lassie, and they also suspected that Winslow and Michelle had encountered bad things. Luo An's eyes flashed with a thoughtful look. After a few seconds of silence, his face suddenly became very serious. He ordered in a firm voice, "Chanel, Lassie, you two will set out now and lead 5 SWAT teams to raid and arrest the base of the organization and its members. Mona, you and I will come together. We will lead 2 SWAT teams and set out to arrest the top leader of the organization." In the previous investigation, the agents of the 13th investigation team had already figured out the location of the organization base, which was in a medium-sized manor in the suburbs of New York. Luo An also found a design company through investigation, and obtained the structural construction drawings of the manor from there, and figured out the buildings and layout in the manor. The leader of the organization was a guy named Francisco. On the surface, he was a rich man who ran a chain of hotels. He usually went to various banquets and evening parties, and donated a lot of charity money. But according to the careful investigation of Luo An and others, this Francisco was actually a fake name. His real name was actually Nacho Jones. 14 years ago, he was a pastor who believed in God, and led believers to worship every week. Hearing Luo An's order, Lassie and the other two suddenly widened their eyes. Mona hesitated for a few seconds and asked, "Luo An, Winslow and Michelle?" "They are fine." Luo An shook his head. Winslow and Michelle were in the office area of the 13th investigation team, which is the FBI Washington headquarters. There are few people who can break into there directly, and there are not many people who can make them lose contact. If someone maliciously took the two away, when Luo An called, the other party would definitely answer the phone and put forward their own conditions or state their own requirements. But now no one has answered the phone, plus the order that Vereen's just said on the phone. The combination of the two immediately made Luo An think of a possibility. Time is urgent. Luo An did not explain in detail to Mona and the other two. He quickly took the weapons and equipment, and the 4 of them immediately divided into 2 sides, and led the SWAT action team to set off. Francisco, or Nacho Jones, lives in a large villa area in southern New York. The black sub and the black troop carrier quickly arrived at the target villa. After the vehicles were parked, everyone got out quickly and rushed into the villa immediately. Boom. The door of the villa was smashed by a battering ram. The SWAT team members holding explosion-proof shields rushed into the villa first, followed by Roan and Mona and other SWAT team members. FBI. Don't move. Stand up. Don't do anything else. Put your hands behind your head. There were several people in the villa who were handling sanitation. The SWAT team members were shocked by their actions. After reacting, they raised their hands and stood against the wall as required. Soon, all the rooms in the villa were checked, and Nacho Jones was not found. After asking the staff who were handling sanitation, they learned that they were just people from the cleaning company and had just arrived in the villa not long ago and knew nothing about these situations. Mona returned to the SUV, took out the computer, and began to retrieve the nearby surveillance video, while Roan found the community leader of this villa area. Sorry, agent. The community leader of this villa area was a white man who looked to be in his 30s. He wore a suit and had a slicked back hair. Upon hearing Roan's question, he smiled and said, "We cannot disclose the privacy of our clients." Roan remained expressionless and said with a smile, "That is to say, you know the time when Mr. Francisco left this area, right?" The community leader smiled slightly and did not answer. Seeing this, Roan also grinned, waved his hand and said, "It's okay if you don't want to say it. By the way, you'd better not leave New York City these days. If something happens to Mr. Francisco, we will definitely need to talk to you who has wasted time and hindered the federal agents' law enforcement. After all, you knew about it, but did not report it, and you are highly suspected." The community leader's eyelids twitched, and after a brief silence, he whispered, "Half an hour ago, Mr. Francisco and his driver drove away from here on the southern highway of the community." "Good." Roan nodded with satisfaction, turned to look at Mona who was typing on the keyboard, and a few seconds later, Mona clapped her hands and said excitedly, "We found them." Roan didn't waste any words and immediately shouted, "Let's go." He stepped on the accelerator to the bottom, and the sub rushed out like a sword, followed by the SWAT transport vehicle. The two black cars quickly began to chase in the direction Mona found. While driving, Roan said, "Contact NYPD and ask them to help set up a checkpoint to intercept the target person." Already contacted, NYPD is mobilizing people to take action. Mona nodded in the passenger seat, saying that she had contacted NYPD as soon as she found Francisco and his driver. "Okay." Luo An then asked, "How are Chinia and Lassie?" "They are going well." Feeling the increasing speed of the car, Mona calmly tightened her seatbelt and replied, "They led the SWAT team to surround the manor and are carrying out a raid." The security personnel of the organization resisted fiercely, and the two sides have started to exchange fire, but the strength of those security personnel is average. Lassie, Chinia and the SWAT team are making steady progress. Send them a message. Luo An thought for a moment and said, "Tell them to pay more attention to the hostages in the hands of that group of people, as well as the problems with the secret passages. When Westerners design manors, they usually secretly build some secret passages to prepare for unexpected events." Luo An had discovered traces of several secret passages during his previous investigation of the manor. Before launching the operation today, he had marked some red lines on the manor design drawings. Understood. Mona nodded heavily and started typing on the keyboard. "I'll send a message to Lassie and Chanel right away." The black SUV shuttled back and forth in the traffic on the streets of New York, speeding. Seeing the red and green lights not far away began to flash, Roan was about to step on the accelerator to rush out first. Mona's face suddenly changed, and she exclaimed, "Roan." The NYPD sent a message that they were attacked. Roan's expression was stern, and he slightly released the accelerator and asked, "The person who launched the attack was Francisco or his driver?" "It was a group of guys who suddenly appeared." Mona quickly typed on the keyboard and retrieved the surveillance video near the scene of the incident, trying to figure out the situation there, and said, "The NYPD doesn't know the identity of that group of people. They don't know if they are Francisco's men or a third party." A cold color flashed in Roan's eyes, and he said coldly, "For example, someone who wants to kill Francisco to silence him." This. Mona frowned and was about to speak when a truck suddenly rushed out from the intersection ahead and rammed into the SUV driven by Luo An. Chapter 596 Car Accident Driver's Identity, Pursuit. Greetings. At the intersection, the green light was flashing, and it was about to turn yellow and then red. Most of the cars on the road began to slow down consciously. At this moment, a truck loaded with goods seemed to have brake failure. In the horrified eyes of passers-by and drivers, it crashed straight into a black SUV at the intersection. Fouquet. Oh my god. Jesus. How licksy. The drivers on the road and the passers-by on both sides of the road changed their faces when they saw this scene. Many women subconsciously covered their eyes or mouths. They could already imagine what kind of tragic scene would happen on the road in the next second. The direction of the truck rushing was the left side of the road, which was the left-hand side of Luo An's driver's seat. Mona was turning her head to look at Luo An and was about to speak. Seeing the fast approaching car, her face suddenly changed, and she shouted in shock, Luo An, be careful. Hold on your seatbelt. Luo An's face was stern, and he shouted loudly, then suddenly shifted gears, stepped on the accelerator, and turned the steering wheel to the right. Just before the big truck appeared, the emotional perception in his mind sent a strong warning signal, and Luo An instantly discovered the truck rushing towards him. After all, cars are mechanical objects, and they are not as flexible as human bodies. If Luo An was not driving at this time, and the truck wanted to hit him, Luo An had several ways to easily avoid it. But at this time he was driving an SUV, and he had the ability to jump out of the car and escape. Mona, who was sitting in the passenger seat, could not react in such a short time, and she would definitely be injured, or even die in the end. Thousands of thoughts flashed through his mind in an instant, and Luo An quickly found the most suitable solution for the moment. It was too late to brake, so he might as well keep going. In the stunned eyes of passers-by and drivers on the road, the SUV suddenly accelerated and turned right, aiming the rear of the car at the front of the truck. Boom. The next second, the out-of-control truck hit the rear of the SUV heavily, and under the huge inertia, the SUV rushed to the right uncontrollably for more than 10 meters. Leaving two deep ruts on the road, the black SUV suddenly rushed out from the left side, bypassing the truck, and stopping on the side of the road at the cost of a big hole in the rear of the car. The airbag exploded, but the two people in the driver's seat and the front passenger seat were intact. Holy cow. Are you kidding me? No fucking way. Who is that driver? The truck hit the road guardrail heavily, but the SUV moved sideways in the blink of an eye and finally stopped on the side of the road smoothly. The scene caused the passers-by on both sides of the road to stare wide-eyed. The drivers were also shocked, with unbelievable eyes. In the SUV, Mona, who was sitting on the front passenger seat, was also in shock. What happened just now happened too fast, and she still didn't react. Bang. Luo An didn't waste any words. In the curious and shocked eyes of the passers-by, he opened the door and got out of the SUV, then walked to the front of the truck, opened the door, and pulled the driver down. The truck driver was a middle-aged white man who looked to be in his 40s. He was wearing the most common jeans and jacket suit in the Federation. When he was pulled out of the car by Roan, his face looked as if he had seen a ghost. He had never expected Roan's action just now. Hello, I'm the FBI. Roan's face was not angry at all, but full of sunshine-like smiles. He asked directly, do you know me? The truck driver shook his head and said hurriedly, I don't know you. I really didn't mean it. The brakes were out of control. I don't know what happened. Lies. The emotional perception in his mind immediately gave the judgment that the other party was lying. Roan was not surprised at all. Even without emotional perception, when he pulled the truck driver out of the car just now, he saw the coldness in the other party's eyes that could not be concealed. In addition, when facing him, the truck driver continued to exude negative emotions. Roan was sure that the other party was coming for him. Sorry, I really didn't mean it. I'm willing to pay for it. The truck driver apologized again and again, and his attitude seemed very sincere. Roan was too lazy to talk nonsense with him, and directly hit him on the back of his head with his right fist. Bang, with a muffled sound, the truck driver rolled his eyes and fainted instantly. In the blind spot of the surveillance and a place where others could not see, Luo An took out a bottle of sleeping potion and poured it into the truck driver's mouth. Luo An carried him back to the SUV. Because the rear of the car was hit, the back seat of the SUV had become too narrow and difficult to sit. Luo An didn't care. Although the seat was rotten, there was still room on the ground. He didn't plan to let the other party sit, and lying down was fine, so he threw the sleeping truck driver in. Luo An took out a dagger and cut off the airbag. He sat back in the driver's seat and started the car. Mona, who was sitting in the passenger seat, took a few deep breaths and finally suppressed the panic in her heart. Seeing the truck driver in the back seat of the car, Mona frowned and asked, This guy is coming for us." Starting the SUV and continuing to move towards the target location, Roan explained coldly, while driving the car, "We can't leave him at the intersection, and we can't hand him over to the NYPD. I'm afraid he will suddenly get shot in the back and commit suicide on the spot." Mona understood the subtext in Roan's words. She noticed another problem and asked in a low voice, "Our operation is urgent and fast. How did this guy know our route?" Community leaders, passers-by, surveillance, and even the SWAT team members and the troop carrier behind are all possible. A thoughtful light flashed in Roan's eyes, and suddenly he laughed in a low voice. "There really are brainless guys." "What?" Mona tilted her head. She didn't understand the meaning of Roan's next sentence. Roan didn't explain, but said, "You stay in this SUV and keep an eye on the truck driver. Don't let anyone else take him away." "Understood." Mona nodded heavily, and Roan stopped talking nonsense. The SUV passed a passing book and stepped on the accelerator again. It was moving forward at a high speed, and the noise was deafening. Because the rear of the car was hit, the glass of the back seat was shattered all over the ground, and the wind noise of the SUV at high speed was extremely loud. Mona tapped the keyboard for a while and shouted, "Roan. The group that suddenly appeared and attacked the NYPD just now has taken Francisco, also known as Nacho Jones. And this group has escaped the encirclement of the NYPD. They are heading west." Roan's eyes moved slightly and asked, "The specific location?" Mona quickly planned the route, and Roan didn't waste any words, and turned the steering wheel again, to change the direction of travel. Not long after, the SUV passed the passing car, and caught up with the group. There were 3 cars in total, all off-road vehicles. Mona said that the NYPD said that the number of people in this group was about 10. "Okay." Luo An nodded. Before he could speak, the last of the 3 off-road vehicles in front saw the damaged SUV following closely behind. The people inside suddenly took out their guns, aimed at Luo An and Mona, and pulled the trigger. Bang, 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 bang. A bunch of bullets hit the hood and front window of the SUV crazily. Mona immediately took out her gun, opened the right window, and fired at the other party. Seeing the bulletproof glass of the front window cracking a little bit, Mona hurriedly shouted, "Luo An, what should I do?" "Put your arms back, hold your seat belts tightly, remember my orders just now, and leave the rest to me." Luo An narrowed his eyes slightly, took out the wrench from the toolbox to jam the accelerator, and then took out a pistol from his waist. The accelerator was stuck, and the speed of the SUV increased sharply, and soon it collided with the off-road vehicle in front. Bang! With a loud bang, the 2 guys who were shooting in the off-road vehicle instantly leaned back uncontrollably and paused their shooting. At the same time, the SUV's window glass was shattered by the last few bullets fired by the other party under Mona's horrified gaze. Luo An, who had already unbuckled his seatbelt, took advantage of the inertia caused by the shattered glass and the collision of the 2 cars and suddenly flew out of the front window. He took out his pistol and smashed the rear window of the SUV, and then grabbed it and got in directly. This series of events happened too quickly. Before the people in the Jeep could react, a gentle unfamiliar male voice suddenly sounded in their ears. "Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to meet you." Chapter 597 successfully arrested the guy who suddenly appeared. Fouquet. Shit. Son of. There were 4 people in the SUV, 1 in the driver, and 1 in the co-pilot seat, and 2 in the back seat. They were also the guys who shot at the damaged SUV from the back. Luo An suddenly broke the rear window and got into the SUV. Although his tone was very gentle, it still scared the 4 people. The driver couldn't move while driving, and the 2 guys who shot backwards were half out of the window and couldn't get back into the car immediately, so the white man in the co-pilot seat immediately took out his pistol and turned around to attack Luo An. Bang! Luo An was faster than him. He raised his hand to grab the gun of the co-pilot man and lifted it up to make the other party miss. Then Luo An twisted his joints to force the other party to let go and took the pistol, aimed at the other party's eyebrows and pulled the trigger. Bang! The bullet was fired and the red and white stuff splashed on the glass. Luo An then shot left and right, hitting the two enemies in the backseat of the car with 2 punches, the common weaknesses of men. Bang! Bang! 2 muffled sounds. The eyes of the 2 enemies, half of their bodies outside the car, bulged instantly. Luo An then grabbed the enemy on the right, shot him dead, and threw him out of the SUV, and kicked the enemy on the left out of the car window. Then Luo An took the pistol he had snatched from the co-pilot, pointed it at the driver's temple, and asked with a sunny smile, "What's your name? Who sent you here?" There were 4 people in the car, and Luo An killed 3 of them in the blink of an eye. The driver's eyes were full of horror, and beads of sweat oozed from his forehead. He cursed, "You %," while spitting out foul language. The driver pretended to turn the steering wheel. Doing so at high speed would inevitably cause the car to roll over, and he planned to die with Luo An. Bang! The next second, gunshots rang out. Luo An opened the car door and kicked the driver who was shot in the temple out, then closed the door and sat in the driver's seat. They refused to answer my questions. The people behind these guys are getting more and more interested. Roan grinned, stepped on the accelerator to the bottom, and the stolen SUV roared and chased the other 2 SUVs in front. Fouquet. There were 2 more SUVs in front. In the second SUV, a man in a striped suit was sitting in the passenger seat. Seeing the SUV getting closer and closer to him and Roan inside, he immediately cursed, "What are Alex and the others doing? 4 people were killed by 1 person? What a waste." The driver and the 2 white men in the backseat looked very solemn, while Francisco, who had his hands tied and a tape on his mouth, smiled with contempt in his eyes. The man in the striped suit frowned when he saw the smile on his face. He stretched out his hand to pull off the tape on his mouth and asked angrily, "What are you laughing at?" Francisco grinned and asked, "Don't you know that man?" "Who?" Roan Greenwood, head of the 13th Investigation Team of the FBI Washington headquarters, a genius agent with a 100% crime-solving rate. Francisco chuckled and said, "When you were sent out to arrest me, didn't your boss behind you tell him about this?" The man in the striped suit's face suddenly became gloomy, and the smile on Francisco's face became more intense. Seeing this, the man in the striped suit sneered, "What are you laughing at? Aren't you also the person that Roan Greenwood wants to catch?" The smile on Francisco's face froze, and he was about to refute something when the white man next to him suddenly shouted, "Captain, that guy is catching up." Bang! Boom. As soon as the white man in the backseat of the car finished speaking, everyone in the SUV suddenly felt the car shake, and then the whole car was uncontrollably lying on the road, and finally rolled over on all 4 wheels. It was Luo An who drove the stolen SUV, and crashed into the backseat of the SUV where the man in the striped suit was, and stopped in a Pompeii style. Fouquet. The people in the SUV with blood on their heads cursed. Seeing this, the first SUV immediately braked and stopped moving forward, and returned to this place. The 4 guys with weapons got out quickly, and rushed to the rolling SUV, ready to save people, and also ready to fight back, and kill Luo An. "Captain, didn't you?" Bang! A gunshot rang out, and the guy who asked about the captain's condition fell to the ground with a gunshot in his head. The other 3 reacted, and immediately pulled the trigger at the location where Luo An was. Suppress him with firepower. Action on both sides at the same time. The 3 white men were well trained and immediately decided that one of them would suppress firepower, and the other 2 would surround from the side and attack Luo An together. Whoosh! At this moment, a black object suddenly flew out from behind the SUV. One of the white men saw it clearly and his face changed. He shouted, "Fouquet, it's a shock." Bang! Before he finished speaking, the stun grenade exploded. A dazzling white light flashed, and the windows of the 3 SUVs shattered instantly. Bang! Then a gunshot was heard by everyone present. One of the white men fell to the ground instantly. Luo An gave another gift of a peaceful sleep. Damn it. The remaining 2 white men became even more angry. They cursed and prepared to fight back. At this moment, a black troop carrier arrived here. More than a dozen SWAT team members got off the car quickly, raised their weapons and quickly surrounded the area, shouting, "Put down your weapons. Don't move. Put your hands up." Get down. Get down. X to the two white men surrounded by a group of SWAT team members looked at Luo An, who was hiding behind the SUV not far away, and looking at them with a smile. They were immediately angry and their faces flushed, and their chests heaved. They wanted to shoot very much, but their fingers were shaking, and they dared not pull the trigger. Drop your weapons. Luo An's smile became brighter and brighter, and he shouted loudly, throw your weapons aside. Cover your head with your hands. Lie on the ground. X to the two white men's faces turned green, their lips trembled, and they hesitated for a long time, but finally threw their weapons aside. Seeing this, several SWAT team members rushed over and firmly controlled them. Luo An chuckled and ignored the two. In the eyes of the SWAT team members who were either admiring or looking up at him, he walked to the second SUV with four wheels facing up with his weapon in hand, knocked on the door, and asked politely, "Good afternoon, everyone. Are you still alive?" Damn. A difficult insult came from the car. Luo An chuckled and waved to the SWAT team members who were full of admiration, saying, "Call an ambulance, and also, pull these people out." Understood. Several SWAT members hurriedly followed the order. Not long after, Mona also arrived at the area in the SUV. The back of the SUV was hit by a truck, leaving a big dent. The front hit the SUV again, and some things fell off the front. It was a success that the SUV could drive here smoothly. It was normal for it to be slow. Mona got out of the car and ran to Luo An quickly, asking nervously, "Are you okay?" Luo An's previous actions not only scared the enemies, but also completely surprised her. "It's okay." Luo An reached out and wiped off the dust on Mona's face. He smiled and said, "Don't worry, I know my limits." Before Mona could speak, Luo An suddenly found two strange men in suits supporting Francisco towards the ambulance. He immediately walked over to stop them and asked, "Who are you?" The two men in suits looked at each other. The man on the left smiled, stretched out his hand to Luo An, and said, "Hello, team leader Luo An. Thank you for your hard work. We will take care of the rest." Chapter 598. The Secret Service suddenly appeared, snatching the scene and the suspect. "You are responsible for what happens next." Hearing this, Mona immediately realized that something was wrong and walked up quickly. Luo An's expression remained unchanged. He ignored the hand that the other party stretched out to him. He smiled and asked, "Teachers, please introduce your identities." The man in the suit on the left saw that Luo An did not intend to shake hands, and he was not embarrassed. He pretended that nothing had happened and took his hand back very naturally and smiled. "We are from the USSS, Secret Service." Mona's face changed slightly. The man in the suit put his hand in his pocket after speaking, preparing to take out his ID. The next second, Luo An's eyes moved slightly, and he suddenly rushed forward. Before the man in the suit on the left could react, he punched him in the stomach. Bang! Then Luo An threw another hook, and the man in the suit on the left rolled his eyes and fainted on the ground. "You." Seeing this, the man in the suit on the right changed his face and immediately took out a pistol from his pocket. Luo An quickly dodged and ran in front of him, grabbed the muzzle of the gun, and raised it upwards, avoiding the other party's whip kick, and threw another punch. Bang! The sharp punch caused the pupils of the man in the suit on the right to shrink, but Roan was too fast for him to dodge. In the end, he and his partner rolled their eyes and fainted on the ground. Roan knocked down the two people in less than 8 seconds. Only when they fell to the ground did the people around them react to what happened. Just as they were about to come over, Roan immediately pulled Mona and threw the fainted truck driver in the SUV and Francisco into the ambulance. After driving the driver and the nurse out of the car, Roan drove the ambulance away from the area immediately. In the back of the ambulance, Mona looked at Roan, who was driving, with a frown. "Roan, you just beat up the Secret Service, didn't you? Who can prove that they are from the Secret Service?" Roan waved his hand to interrupt Mona, saying that the two people just said that they were from the Secret Service, but did not produce any documents to prove their identity. Mona looked at him strangely and asked, "Didn't the guy on the left put his hands in his pockets?" Luo An nodded and then said, "This is the federal government. I'm an FBI agent." The other party was talking and suddenly put his hands in his pockets. I suspected that he was going to pull out a gun to attack. The guy on the right pulled out a gun at the first time, proving that my guess was correct. Luo An's meaning was very simple. You said you were a member of the Secret Service. How can you prove this? After all, words are not enough. As for knocking down the two men just now, it was mainly because Luo An was worried that the other party would pull out a gun and attack him while he was not paying attention. Of course, it is not difficult to see Luo An's idea. Before the other party took out specific documents to prove his identity, he knocked the other party down first to prevent Francisco from being taken away by them. Although it can be seen, Luo An's reasons are very sufficient, and the other party cannot prove Luo An's true intentions. As long as Francisco is in hand, Luo An can take the initiative. With Mr. Clement behind him, the matter will definitely not be a big deal. At most, he will apologize later. Mona understood what Luo An meant, and so did Francisco next to him. He raised his eyebrows and asked, "Team Leader Luo An, where are we going?" "Definitely not the hospital." Luo An grinned, looked at Francisco through the rearview mirror, and said, "Mr. Francisco, you are really a popular person. So many people want to take you away." Because the sub was overturned just now, Francisco's head was broken, his face and the back of his head were covered in blood, his right arm was broken, and there were bruises and contusions on his arms, thighs, front and back of his body, and he looked very embarrassed. Hearing Roan's words, Francisco showed an ugly smile. Then he noticed a problem and asked hurriedly, "Not going to the hospital? Then where should we go? My wounds need treatment. There are too many people who want to kill you. Going to the hospital is not to treat the wounds, but to seek death." Roan blocked the steering wheel of the ambulance and asked Mona to drive the car. When changing positions, Roan whispered something in Mona's ear. Mona nodded and started driving the ambulance forward. Moving to the back compartment, Roan found a medicine box for emergency treatment from under the seat, took out a bottle of iodine and a bandage, looked up and showed Francisco a sunny smile. "Your wound is not serious, you won't die in a short time. Bear it, don't shout." Francisco's pupils shrank suddenly, and before he could refuse, Roan stuffed an unknown rag he found into his mouth, and then poured iodine on his wound. A few minutes later, Francisco's wounds were all wrapped with bandages, and Roan made a simple splint for his fractured right arm using the disassembled seat parts. "Okay." After tying the splint bandage behind Francisco's neck, Roan sat back in his seat and said with a smile, "Don't forget to pay for my medical expenses later." Francisco's thighs, forearms, and muscles all over his body twitched unconsciously from time to time. His eyes were dull, and he didn't want to answer at all. At this moment, Mona's cell phone suddenly rang, and she took it out and handed it to Luo An. "It's Lassie." Luo An took the phone and just pressed the answer button. Lassie's angry voice rang on the phone. "Team leader, Chinia and I have led the SWAT team and successfully destroyed the organization Manor. Now suddenly a few agents from the USSS, Secret Service, appeared and said that they would take over the rest of the matter." Luo An's expression remained unchanged, and he said in a calm voice, "I know, leave the scene to them. You and Chinia lead the team back immediately." "What?" Lassie was very surprised, and just as she was about to ask, she suddenly realized something, and said in a deep voice, "I know." After hanging up the phone, Luo An did not return the phone to Mona immediately, but first found the text message page, and sent a simple message. At the same time, in a manner, Lassie's face was not good. After hanging up the phone, suddenly, her phone vibrated. She looked down at the text message and sighed. A gleam flashed in Lassie's eyes. Then she deleted the text message calmly, and turned to Chinia, who was not far away. In front of Chinia, stood 7 white men in suits. Before Lassie returned, she was confronting this group of people. Seeing Lassie return, Chinia immediately asked, "What do you say? Leave the scene to them." Lassie snorted coldly, glared at the white men fiercely, and pulled Chinia out, saying as she walked, "You win." Her tone was full of dissatisfaction. Chinia was about to speak when Lassie suddenly pinched her hand. Chinia immediately came to her senses, turned around and spit at the feet of the white men, snorted coldly, and turned away. The 2 women left with the SWAT team, and the men in suits looked a little proud. But the man in the lead, who had a short haircut and a big hooked nose, did not change his expression at all. He waved his hand to signal his men to deal with the scene, and he walked aside, took out his mobile phone, and made a call. The first call rang for a while but no one answered. The hook-nosed man frowned and made the second call. After another ring, the phone was finally connected. The hook-nosed man immediately asked, "How is the target person?" "Sorry, Captain." The person on the other end of the phone was one of the two-suited men who had been knocked down by Roan. He rubbed his painful cheek and whispered, "The person was taken away by Roan Greenwood." The hook-nosed man looked ugly, but he didn't curse. Instead, he asked, "What happened?" The suited man briefly described the situation at the time. The hook-nosed man's face was gloomy. "You and Bob are the two best players in our team. How could you not beat Roan Greenwood? That guy is very fast and very strong, far beyond our expectations." The suited man's face was not good. He and Bob had encountered many agile enemies over the years and arrested many vicious criminals. The two were very confident in their skills, which was why the hook-nosed man sent them to Roan's side. But they never expected that they both didn't react at all and fell into Roan's hands as soon as they met. The man in the suit and Bob beside him were very angry after waking up. On the one hand, they were angry that Roan beat them down, and on the other hand, they were angry about Roan's identity. "You are such a good guy. Why do you stay in the FBI? Secret Service, CIA, which one can't make better use of your strength and make more contributions to the Federation?" Exclamation mark. After the man in the suit finished his narration, the man with the hooked nose looked gloomy, but he didn't say anything critical. After hanging up the phone, he immediately asked his other men to look for the ambulance. Not long after, his men found the ambulance, and the hooked nose immediately led people there personally. But when they arrived there, they found that the ambulance was empty. Chapter 599, FBI Director, Speaker of the House of Representatives. Why is there another person? At the intersection of a highway in New York, Lassie and Chanel, who had just left the manor, got off the car and changed their clothes. They got into a van according to the instructions. The two were surprised to find that in addition to Roan, Mona and the target person Francisco, there was also a sleeping white man in the car. This guy is a truck driver. After everyone arrived, Roan drove away immediately. Mona briefly described the car accident and the identity of the truck driver. Lassie and Chanel frowned. Lassie asked first, "Where did you get this car?" "I borrowed it from a passerby." Roan smiled. When he drove away in the ambulance before, he had already thought of changing cars halfway. The ambulance target was too conspicuous, and there was surveillance and positioning inside, so it was easy to be discovered and found. As for whether the owner of the van would not expose this matter, Roan was not worried, because the car had been parked on the side of the road for a long time, it was covered with dust, and it had not been driven for a long time. Now that Roan has driven away, the owner of the car should not mind. The van was moving forward at a high speed. Chanel looked at Francisco with a very serious face and asked, "What on earth do you have in your hand?" Not only did it attract the Secret Service to come forward, but it also caused the Secret Service to send a truck driver to hit our team leader in an attempt to stop his arrest. "You said one thing wrong, Chanel." Without waiting for Francisco to answer, Roan shook his head and said, "The truck driver was most likely not sent by the Secret Service, but someone else." After the brief contact just now, Roan speculated that the Secret Service's goal was to take away or cover up the case. Sending a truck driver to hit Roan not only did not seem like the Secret Service's work, but it was also unnecessary, because it would only make things worse. Chanel frowned slightly. Lassie looked at the truck driver who was still sleeping in the back and complained, "Has this guy not slept for several months? He hasn't woken up after being carried by Roan and Mona for so long?" Roan, who had secretly fed the truck driver a bottle of sleeping potion when no one was paying attention, suddenly jumped and changed the subject. "The truck driver's matter is not important. The most important issue now is Francisco. What do you have in your hand? Ledger? Video recording of someone? Or something else?" When Roan asked the question, several people in the car immediately turned their attention to Francisco, who was sitting next to them with a bandage on his head. Francisco was silent for a moment, then asked tentatively, "Captain Roan, I'm willing to pay $5 million and give you all those things. How about you let me go?" "There is no need to say such things." Roan laughed, and Mona and Chinia's eyes flashed with disdain. Lassie was too lazy to continue talking nonsense and asked directly, "What is it?" Francisca was silent for a long time, sighed, and said a few words. Roan frowned slightly when he heard this, while Mona, Lassie and Chinia's eyes widened instantly, their faces full of shock. At the same time, at the FBI Washington headquarters. At this time, Mr. Clement did not stay in his office as usual, but sat in an office larger than his office, facing an elderly white man with a bald head. The bald white man looked serious. He reached out and knocked on the table and said in a serious tone, "The Secret Service just called me and said that our FBI took the lead and arrested the suspect." "What happened exactly?" "Sorry, Director, I don't know what happened either." Mr. Clement looked calmly at the FBI director in front of him and said slowly, "You know, I just came back not long ago and received your order. I also issued a notice according to your request. I didn't ask about the subsequent things." The man sitting behind the large desk opposite Mr. Clement was the FBI director, Robert. Director Robert glanced at Mr. Clement and then said, "You go back and figure this out as soon as possible." "Okay." Mr. Clement nodded, stood up and walked out of the director's office. The door closed, and Director Robert leaned back, closed his eyes, and began to rub his temples. The 8-year term of the former president is about to end, and the federal government will soon start a new presidential election. The FBI is nominally a neutral law enforcement agency and a tool to maintain federal laws. It has nothing to do with things in the political arena. But the so-called separation of powers in the federal government is actually not separated in many things. As the FBI director appointed by the president, Robert also cannot get rid of the problem of position. Director Robert sat in his office frowning and thinking. After Mr. Clement walked out of the room, he was about to ask the secretary who was waiting in the corridor to contact Verinus when the secretary's phone rang. Mr. Clement's brows twitched slightly. He took the phone and pressed the answer button. Roan's voice immediately rang out on the phone. "Good afternoon, Mr. Clement." "Good afternoon, Roan." Mr. Clement replied casually, briefly recounting the questions that Director Robert had just asked him, and then asked, "Is the suspect in that serial murder case in the hands of your investigation team 13 now?" "Yes," Roan said while driving. "We successfully arrested the other party." Mr. Clement frowned slightly when he heard this and was about to repeat his previous order to Verinus, that is, to start the action tomorrow, but Roan said first, "In addition, according to our interrogation, this case is somewhat related to Mike." "Mike?" Mr. Clement was slightly stunned and soon thought of something and asked in a deep voice, "Which Mike?" Roan narrowed his eyes and replied, "It's the Mike you are thinking of, Mr. Clement. There are no less than hundreds of thousands of men named Mike in the Federation." But when he heard Roan's words, Mr. Clement's breathing suddenly became a little rapid. At this moment, Verine suddenly walked out from the corner of the corridor in the distance, quickly walked to Mr. Clement, handed him a folder with an expressionless face, and said, "Sir, urgent documents." Mr. Clement's expression changed slightly. He took the folder and looked at it for a few seconds, then quickly picked up the phone and asked, "Luo An, are you sure the news is 100% correct?" "I can't be sure." Hearing the other party's question, Luo An immediately gave a negative answer. Mr. Clement's face froze, and Verinus frowned slightly. Just as she was about to say something, Roan, who was driving, looked at the rearview mirror and added, "But those people from the Secret Service are chasing us now. I trust their judgment more." Mr. Clement did not hesitate to hear this and immediately said, "I will send someone to pick you up right away." "Okay." After hanging up the phone, Mr. Clement was about to order Verinus, but Verinus said first, "I have sent someone to pick up team leader Roan and the others." Mr. Clement looked at Verinus with a little surprise, nodded without saying anything, and turned around and went to the director's office again with his secretary. After knocking on the door and entering, Director Robert's face darkened slightly. "You figured it out so quickly? What exactly happened?" Mr. Clement walked up, put the folder on the director's desk, and said, "The Secret Service did not tell the truth. This matter is actually related to Speaker of the House Mike Monroe." "What?" Hearing the word Speaker of the House, Director Robert was very surprised and quickly picked up the folder to read it carefully. At the same time, on the other side, on a road from New York to Washington, D.C., a van was speeding in front, followed closely by 4 SUVs, forming a beautiful landscape. Chapter 600. Luo An is being chased. The police block the road. On a road from New York to Washington, D.C., there was a lot of traffic, and all you could see were car heads and headlights. In the traffic that was moving forward at a constant speed, many drivers were driving calmly. Suddenly, a van moved left and right and sped past their cars, which scared them. Fouquet. What is that? Jesus. The van disappeared in the blink of an eye, leaving only its taillights behind them, causing many drivers to be shocked and curse. Many hot-tempered guys wanted to catch up immediately and ask the owner of the van why he was driving so fast. Was he in a hurry to see God? There was a lot of traffic now, and although the drivers were angry, there were not many people who were really ready to chase the van. Only a few hot-tempered guys silently took out guns from under their seats. If they saw the van again, they planned to give the owner of the van a few gifts. After saying a few words of greeting to the van owner, the passers-by drivers continued to drive. At this moment, they suddenly saw from the rearview mirror that 4 more SUVs were rushing up at high speed. Whoosh, but 4 SUVs were lined up in front and behind, shuttling through the traffic at high speed. In less than a few seconds, the passers-by drivers were frightened by them again. Damn it. Son of eating. The passers-by drivers cursed again, but while cursing, they silently erased the idea of racing with the other party or catching up to give them some gifts. The situation was obvious. These 4 SUVs were obviously going for the previous van. Although they didn't know what happened specifically, living in the Federation, everyone has developed a good habit of not asking too many questions. However, many passers-by drivers were still very curious. They wanted to know what the van owner had done. They admired his driving skills very much, and at the same time, they despised the SUV driver. 4 SUVs couldn't catch up with the van. Are you kidding me? At the same time, in the SUV at the front, the hook-nosed man sat in the passenger seat, looking at the van that was not getting closer, but getting farther away, his eyes full of astonishment. The driver, whose forehead was already covered with sweat, and whose face looked as if he had seen a ghost, said quickly, "Captain, our SUVs are too wide. It's not easy to overtake." Compared to the 1.5 meter wide van, the width of their SUVs was about 1.8 meters, which was indeed much wider, and not easy to overtake. The hook-nosed man knew about this, so he did not scold the driver, but he still didn't understand another thing. How could that guy drive so fast in a van? On the other side, in the van, Lassie in the passenger seat, Mona and Chinia in the back seat, had already gotten used to Ron's driving style, and just silently fastened their seatbelts. The truck driver was still sleeping, even snoring. Francisco looked at the figure speeding backwards outside the car window, and the various overtaking postures of the van. He was so scared that his face turned pale and his thighs were shaking. Team leader Luo An, can you slow down? Don't worry, trust my driving skills. Luo An laughed and threw a look to Francisco through the rearview mirror to indicate that he was relieved. Francisco was about to speak when Luo An passed a large truck and added, "And there are so many people in the car. If it really overturns, you will not be the only one injured. What are you afraid of?" Francisco's lips were shaking, and his face was speechless. Luo An didn't continue to pay attention to him. He looked at Lassie and the co-pilot and asked, "Send a message to Verines, and ask when the people she sent will arrive." Lassie pressed the phone a few times and quickly replied, "She said it will take another 10 minutes. Okay." Luo An nodded, and the other people in the car also breathed a sigh of relief. At this moment, Luo An suddenly found that the cars on the road ahead slowed down a lot. Frowning slightly, he immediately asked, "Mona, can you find out what happened on the road ahead? A car accident or something else? It's a surprise inspection." Mona took out her laptop, and her 10 fingers danced on it quickly. She quickly found out the details, looked up and said loudly, "1 minute ago, the police in Washington, D.C. set up a temporary checkpoint." Chinia acted quickly and said anxiously, "I'm afraid it's the people sent by the USSS. The destination is to stop us." The time when the police appeared was too coincidental, and Chinia couldn't help but think in this direction. Mona and Lassie also reacted. Seeing that the speed of the car ahead was getting slower and slower, and there was almost no place to overtake in the middle of the road, the girls were very anxious. Lassie asked hurriedly, "What should we do?" Because the cars in front gradually stopped, the speed of the van was getting slower and slower. Roan narrowed his eyes slightly, looked at the SUVs behind that were not affected by the exhaust gas, and made a decision quickly. "Get out of the car. Let's go to the checkpoint." "What?" The girls were very surprised. Roan didn't explain much. He parked the van on the side of the road, got out, opened the back door, carried the truck driver, and walked away quickly. Mona, Lassie, and Chenia were puzzled, but they still took Francisco and followed quickly. Not far away, they saw a temporary checkpoint. Roan threw the truck driver to the ground, motioned Mona and the others to stand there and wait, and he walked towards the checkpoint alone. "Hello, FBI." Roan took out the FBI's golden badge to show his identity. "Why did you set up a temporary checkpoint?" The sheriff next to him came over, stretched out his hand to Roan, and introduced himself. "My name is Roland. Roan Greenwood." Roan stretched out his hand and shook hands with the other party. After the two briefly introduced their names, Sheriff Roland replied, "We just received a notice that there are suspicious people in this area and we need to check it out." Roan's eyes moved slightly, and he didn't discuss this topic anymore. After a few simple greetings, he said, "My team and I are carrying out a mission and need to borrow your police car temporarily." Roan said that he would briefly explain the matter to Roland's superiors later. After looking at Roan's FBI golden badge and comparing the ID number on the badge, Roland confirmed that Roan's identity was correct, and he nodded and agreed. Roan thanked him again, turned around and returned to a car not far away, and walked out with Mona and the other girls carrying the truck driver. The three women pressed Francisco into a police car. As for the truck driver, Roan stuffed him directly into the trunk under the astonished eyes of Sheriff Roland. Roan nodded to Sheriff Roland to show his gratitude, sat in the driver's seat, and drove the police car away from the area quickly. Seeing the checkpoint behind getting smaller and smaller, Lassie and Mona looked at each other in surprise. Francisco was extremely shocked. Lassie asked in doubt, "Roan, do you know that policeman?" "No, we met for the first time." Roan grinned and said that he had just put himself in the shoes of the policeman. The Secret Service did not want to make a big deal, so they probably just wanted to send the police to help stop it, not really wanting the police to help arrest. In this case, the Secret Service could not state Roan and others' FBI identities. Those police probably only knew that there were suspicious people, and at most they knew that the suspicious people drove a van. So Roan decided to leave the van and walk to the checkpoint, reveal his identity to the police, and borrow the police car openly. Roan's ID and identity were fine, so the Metropolitan Police would most likely lend him a car out of respect. When the Secret Service arrived at the checkpoint, they were absolutely furious and wanted to curse, but they couldn't blame the police because they hadn't previously disclosed the identities of Roan and the others. Lassie and Mona were full of admiration, Chanel applauded, and Francis was stunned. Facts proved that Roan's inference was correct. The red and blue lights on the roof of the police car were turned on, the alarm sounded, and passers-by and cars on the road ahead immediately gave way. Roan opened the car window, his hair was slightly messy from being blown, and the corners of his mouth slightly raised, and he said lightly, "Lassie, contact Veronis and ask her to call the people back. With the help of the Secret Service, we should arrive early." End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.